They were a couple lifted straight from the pages of a modern fairy tale.
She's got a successful career. She's living in one of the most vibrant cities in the world.
He was charming and exciting and loving, everything she always wanted in a partner.
They became a power couple. They'd make the perfect team.
But a foreboding call turns this romance story into a bone-chilling thriller.
I just got word that something horrible has happened.
He opened a suitcase and he discovered a letter, a typed letter.
It was clear to all of us that something wasn't right.
Detectives find themselves thrown into a case more sensational than most.
He was trying to turn this whole situation into an action-adventure novel.
It was very strange. I've never come across anything like that before in my career.
And with two sides to every story, it's up to investigators to determine which one to believe.
She found out he was hiding a secret.
When you get emotion involved, anything can happen.
Jealousy took over, and at some point it was uncontrollable.
There's an old saying, if somebody shows you who they are, you should believe them.
October 22nd, 2018, Montclair, New Jersey. It's a peaceful night in this upscale community, less than 20 miles west of Manhattan.
Montclair, New Jersey is a quiet, tree-lined street town that's considered a suburb of New York City.
It's very affluent. So there's a lot of homes that are over $1 million, and there's not a lot of crime.
But just before midnight, local police receive a cryptic tip.
At approximately 11:45 p.m., the police in Montclair, New Jersey, get a phone call from a man named Doug Pearson.
Montclair Police. Hello, I live in Pennsylvania. I just got word that something horrible, I think, has happened there in Montclair, and no one is there to call in.
What happened?
I am not certain, but it sounds like there might be a murder victim there.
He said a woman by the name of Angela Bledsoe could be inside of a home in Montclair, dead.
Doug gives dispatch an address, and within minutes, a team of Montclair police officers are en route to the residence.
I responded to the scene, a larger single-family dwelling, mid-block on a quiet residential street.
Police enter the home with guns drawn, not sure what they're gonna walk into. However, when they flipped the lights on, their fears were confirmed.
The body of Miss Bledsoe was on the floor of the kitchen.
There was quite a bit of blood where she was laying, and some of that blood had been there for a while.
Officers on scene confirm the caller's tip to headquarters.
Our units are going to be tied up for a little while. This just turned into a homicide investigation.
This one was the first homicide that I had been called about in my acting prosecutor position, and it was a name that was not unfamiliar to me, Angela Bledsoe.
Angela had a stellar reputation in her community.
In fact, 44-year-old Angela Bledsoe had achieved the kind of success that's envied by many.
She was a graduate of Florida A&M, a historically Black university in Tallahassee.
She was also a part of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated, an organization that focuses on bettering the community.
She seems to have been a person who found her way through solid programs and grew to be quite a successful young woman.
After graduating in 1997, Angela got right to work.
She accepted a high-paying position in New York City as a financial consultant at a multinational bank.
She was so successful in her 20s that she was making more money than her parents had in a lifetime, practically. And they were so supportive of her.
She keeps her eyes on the prize, and for her, the prize is $1 million plus brownstone in Brooklyn before the age of 30, which is quite a rare task.
She continued to climb the corporate ladder, becoming a financial consultant and analyst at various banks and insurance agencies.
But as she reached her mid-30s, Angela began to feel like something was missing.
She wanted to find love. She wanted to enjoy all that life had given to her with someone special.
And in the spring of 2008, she'd find just that.
Angela, hey, great to see you.
Likewise, Mr. Ray.
Please, call me James.
James Ray was an accomplished Manhattan attorney. He specialized in insurance.
They first met when James hired Angela to run his insurance brokerage. He felt that with her business savvy and his experience in law and insurance, they would make the perfect team.
Wow, this is great. I love your ideas.
Thank you.
55-year-old James also had an impressive past before getting his MBA.
Anything that he put his hands on, he did very well. Mr. Ray was a police officer for a short time, served in the Marine Corps, and was also a black belt in a martial art.
Listen, I have another meeting to get to, but how about we continue this conversation later? Over dinner, perhaps?
I would like that.
Great.
Along comes this successful man whose story is a lot like hers. So for her, it feels like, hello, Daddy.
The two soon became great partners in the boardroom and the bedroom.
Despite their 11-year age difference, Angela found James to be charming and exciting and loving, everything she always wanted in a partner.
They would go golfing on weekends, take trips to Martha's Vineyard, and would rub elbows with some of New York's most elite Black community. They became a power couple.
And in 2012, the dynamic duo became a party of three when they welcomed a beautiful baby girl.
Angela enjoyed being a mother, and James enjoyed doting on Angela and their daughter.
As their daughter grew older, James convinced Angela to sell her Brooklyn brownstone and move into his 6-bedroom home in Montclair, New Jersey.
Montclair feels like home. It feels like backyard. Life feels easier. And for a young woman who's probably been on the go since she was in high school to achieve, this probably felt like a place of peace.
But now, Montclair police have responded to a home that's anything but peaceful.
For something like this to happen in Montclair, it's very unheard of. You had a very well-known, likable person who Angela was. This one kind of hit home.
There was a multitude of indicators that were popping up that just didn't settle right with me and the other investigators.
We all had that gut feeling from the moment we walked in the door that there was something wrong here.
By the fall of 2018, Angela Bledsoe and James Ray had skyrocketed to the top of New York's social scene.
Angela was a powerhouse woman, and after meeting James Ray, Angela finally had someone to share her success with.
But on October 22nd, their idyllic Montclair home is swarming with police.
They have found Angela dead, and based on what they see, she was murdered. Angela had been shot 3 times, once in the chest, once in the back, and once in the head.
Police also discover a 4th shot that missed the mark.
There's a clock laying in the kitchen sink, and that clock had fallen from a hook, and it had stopped at 11:14.
It fell into the sink, and as it hit the sink, the battery popped out. Therefore, it memorialized the exact time that the incident occurred. On the floor is where this large pool of blood was, and on top of that pool of blood was this 9mm handgun.
Let's back that up. Let's find out if it's our murder weapon.
Yes, sir.
About 5 or 6 feet away from her is a little stool, and on top of that stool is a phone.
It could belong to the victim, or it could belong to the killer.
Okay, let's back this up, too.
In the adjoining living room, investigators discover even more evidence.
We found a projectile with some blood on it embedded into the love seat. Additionally, we found a handprint or swipe of blood on the armrest of the love seat and the adjacent couch.
The crime scene itself makes it appear as though there's been a tussle.
Detectives are also drawn to the coffee table by the sofa.
On top of the table, we could clearly see empty gun cases and a cleaning kit.
There was 2 handgun boxes on the coffee table, and there was a Springfield XD9 pistol on one of them.
3 .45 caliber shell casings were placed standing up on end, side by side, inside of one of the gun boxes. That is odd, extremely peculiar.
Notably absent from the scene is the gun that matches the 45mm casings.
Hey, have we found a 45 caliber?
No, sir.
We found 9mm pistols. Where's the 45 caliber pistol?
And where is the owner of the home? Angela's boyfriend, James Ray.
I've probably been on over 100 homicide scenes, and this one, it just seemed a little eerie.
It was clear to all of us that something wasn't right.
In their search for answers, detectives circle back around to the 911 caller, a Pennsylvania resident named Doug Pearson.
He was the one that alerted the Montclair Police Department of what had taken place. We bring him back to our headquarters where a formal interview was conducted.
They wanted to know how he knew that Angela was dead.
Well, it all started last night around 6 p.m.
Doug explains that he got an unexpected visit from a family member.
That individual was Angela Bledsoe's boyfriend, James Ray.
Hey, how's it going, man?
I'm good. But listen, I got a favor to ask.
He asked him for an unusual request, and that was to keep his 6-year-old daughter for a week.
Angela and I are slammed with a big work emergency. It'll mean a lot to us if you can watch her.
Doug was family, so he wanted to help, so he reluctantly agreed.
No problem.
Thanks, man. I owe you. I got all her stuff packed. She's waiting in the car. I'll go grab her.
His behaviors were erratic and unusual.
It seems odd, but I never had a reason to doubt him. My wife and I is always happy to help out family. But then
what?
Later that night, they were getting the child ready for bed. He opened a suitcase that was left by James Ray, and he discovered a letter, a typed letter.
Honey!
This letter broke the case wide open.
Oh my God.
Detectives investigating the murder of 44-year-old financial advisor Angela Bledsoe have just learned that her attorney boyfriend, James Ray, was exhibiting strange behavior the night before she was found dead.
He asked a family member, Doug Pearson, to watch their 6-year-old daughter without much explanation.
And when Doug and his wife were getting Angela and James's daughter ready for bed, they made an alarming discovery.
Honey!
This suitcase that James has left includes this ominous note where James confesses to murdering Angela.
He confessed to killing Angela in their Montclair home. But according to James, it wasn't a cold-blooded murder. It was self-defense.
Take a look for yourself.
As detectives read over James's letter, it's clear that his once happy relationship with Angela had taken a dark turn.
James claimed that they would fight all the time and that Angela was becoming violent.
He indicated in the letter that she was cheating.
The letter alleges that on the morning of October 22nd, the situation came to a head.
James claimed he was cleaning his handgun when they got into a heated argument.
He said she grabbed a handgun from off the table and pointed at him. That put him in fear, and he grabbed a gun and he fired at her.
According to the letter, James was afraid no one would believe his story, so he decided to get out of town.
He sets up all of these pieces to make sure his daughter is safe.
He made reference also to checks that were left behind in the suitcase, that it was to go to their young daughter.
And he just, he flees.
James Ray was on the run.
So, did he leave anything else behind?
Yeah, he left his cell phone.
Doug was able to turn James's cell phone into the police. So they suspect the phone located at the crime scene belonged to Angela.
After speaking with Doug, authorities issue a bolo for James and his vehicle to law enforcement agencies in the area, describing him as potentially armed and dangerous.
We had his phone, so tracking his phone was out of the picture. So our next thing was, where's his car? He has to be with his car. So we do a bunch of law enforcement checks on his car. That comes up negative.
While deputies search for James and his vehicle, detectives take a closer look at the cell phone they found at the crime scene.
They confirmed it belonged to Angela Bledsoe.
After working with the carrier to unlock the phone, detectives make a surprising discovery.
There was text messages in Angela's phone that were discovered between Angela and a male friend.
James was right about one thing. Angela was having an affair.
The two had been sexting, and it seemed as though they had met up on several occasions.
Hoping to learn more, detectives reach out to the man Angela had been corresponding with, 44-year-old Leon Holmes.
He lives more than 1,000 miles away in Orlando, Florida.
We identified who that individual was, and we made contact with him. He indicated that he was made aware that Angela was dead.
I found out through a mutual friend. I can't believe she's gone.
On the call, Leon confirms he'd been in a romantic relationship with Angela.
Leon tells investigators they had met as students together at FAMU in the 90s, and after graduation had gone their separate ways.
But a year earlier, in October 2017, Leon says they rekindled the feelings they'd had in college.
Leon says that he reconnected with Angela at a FAMU homecoming reunion. Over happy hour drinks, the two felt a spark and decided to stay in touch.
Leon confirmed that he and Angela had in fact been spending several weekends together between Orlando, where he lived, and New York City.
But according to Leon, he had no idea the connection he and Angela were building was actually an illicit affair.
He thought Angela was single.
Until recently, I had no idea she was in another relationship.
Leon says he didn't find out until October 20th, 2 days before Angela's body was discovered.
Hello?
I don't know who the hell you think you are.
Who is this?
James had discovered text messages between Angela and Leon on her phone.
Shortly after, Mr. Ray contacted the individual and threatened him.
I'm coming for you, man, if you don't stay away from Angela.
Listen, it's not what you...
Think I'm an idiot? Huh? I'm coming for you.
Leon was so frightened by James's rage that as soon as the call ended, he contacted Angela to warn her.
He's concerned for her life because James's behavior and his threats toward him made him feel menaced, and he states away. Angela lives with this man.
Why didn't you tell me?
When Leon asked Angela if her and James were really living together, she confirmed that they were, but implied that the relationship was coming to an end.
Based on what detectives were piecing together, it seemed that as soon as James realized that Angela was having an affair, it really pushed him over the edge. And it seems that that may have driven him to commit murder.
Thank you so much, Leon, and if we need anything else, we'll contact you.
After speaking with Leon, detectives are more eager than ever to track down James Ray, and soon they'll get their chance.
Montclair detectives receive a tip. James's car had been spotted at Newark Liberty International Airport.
At that time, myself, Detective Muhammad, responded there, where we located the vehicle in the parking deck in Newark Airport. It was parked, locked. We could see inside on the dashboard that there was a parking ticket with the date and time.
The ticket shows James had entered the lot around the same time that the police responded to the homicide scene at his house.
The ticket in the window that we can clearly see indicated like 12:01. His car entered that lot.
But frustratingly, there are no clues to where James went next.
Once we conducted a search, Of the entire vehicle, there was no items of evidential value found. We did canvass the parking lot for surveillance video, however, there was none.
The fact that James left his car at an international airport heightens concerns.
Not only is he clearly no longer in the tri-state area, he could be anywhere.
Montclair police decide to recruit help from the FBI.
There's a procedure that you go through with the FBI that you call red tag, someone that might be on the run.
A red notice had to be served through Interpol.
While they wait for leads, detectives reach out to Angela's friends and family, hoping for more information that could help them find James.
As investigators sit down with Angela's loved ones, they're still mourning her loss.
But they also drop a bombshell.
Angela found out that James was keeping a secret.
He had a whole other family on the side.
For 48 hours, law enforcement agencies across the globe have been searching for 55-year-old James Ray, a Manhattan attorney wanted for shooting his girlfriend, Angela Bledsoe, to death.
He's left his cell phone behind, turned off. He dumped his car. He's nowhere to be found.
James also left behind a confession, claiming Angela's murder was an act of self-defense. But her loved ones aren't buying it.
According to Angela's friends and family, the only one that needed help being defended was Angela.
Well, it took us a while to realize what was really going on.
When they first got together, Angela and James were a match made in heaven. They were both successful Manhattanites making a name for themselves.
But the family explains that not long into their relationship, Angela and James hit a major bump in the road.
Angela found out that James was hiding a secret. He was married with 2 adult children.
That was the first red flag. Angela was shocked.
Normally, Angela would never date a married man, but she was so smitten with James, she decided to stick through the relationship.
And when Angela found out she was expecting a child of her own, the couple came to a crossroads.
She was essentially locked into their relationship, so she pushed James to end things with his wife so that they could be a family.
Angela has done too much, worked too hard to build up her name, life, reputation, and career to just be the side chick.
Eventually, James followed through and divorced his wife.
Angela moved in with James in his Montclair home, the same home that he had shared with his first wife.
But according to Angela's family, soon after she moved in with James, things started to change.
That's when he started showing his true colors.
Slowly but surely, she started to reveal that the relationship was not a healthy relationship.
Who's that?
It's just my sister.
You must really think I'm stupid to believe that. You're a liar.
She revealed to them that James Ray was very controlling. He spoke down to her in front of their child. He was demeaning towards her.
There's an old saying, if somebody shows you who they are, you should believe them.
Things reached a tipping point when James was able to confirm that there had been a physical relationship between Angela and Leon Holmes.
I already read the messages. I know you've been running around on me down in Florida.
You know what? I'm out of here.
You know what? You're gonna regret this. Both of you.
Yeah.
James had threatened to beat her and Leon up.
She ultimately made a decision that she was gonna abandon this relationship and seek out a better life for her and her child.
According to the family, in mid-October, Angela had bravely communicated her plans with James.
She'd sent him a text message that she was leaving the relationship, that she has tried everything she can to preserve it, and she was gonna be moving on.
And on October 22nd, the day she was killed, Angela put her plan into action.
She was taking the steps to move out.
She makes an appointment with a realtor to see some houses for she and her daughter.
And he was aware that she had been house hunting.
Angela's family also scoffs at the claims James made in his confession letter, that Angela pulled a gun on him first.
No, no way.
Loved ones all confirmed that Angela was a non-violent person.
It appears that James might have been trying to paint the picture of this angry black woman, but her family paints a completely different picture that seen no signs of any kind of aggression. It just wasn't who she was.
Her family was telling her to get out, and she unfortunately got out, just not in the way that she had hoped. She was removed from that home in a body bag.
Yet after a week with no sign of James, investigators begin to worry that he'll never face the consequences for what he's done.
Investigators are starting to become worried that the case will turn cold.
But on October 28, 2018, they finally catch a big break.
This is Rangers.
I remember it like it was yesterday. I received a phone call from the FBI, and they stated, hey, I think we have your guy. He's on a plane from Mexico City to Cuba. Right now, he's in the air. We're trying to get agents in Cuba so when the plane lands, we could arrest him.
That was an aspect to this case that I didn't expect, that I had never dealt with. While we've extradited people from other places, Cuba certainly wasn't one of them.
For decades, our relationship with Cuba has not been a good one. The fact that we're doing the work to extradite him back is a very big deal.
Fortunately, the plan works.
James was taken into FBI custody after his plane landed.
We were notified that he was coming back on November the 6th at Teterboro Airport, where we go and we wait for him.
Welcome back, James. Are you ready to talk?
But after the FBI hands him over to Montclair police, James refuses to give a statement.
He had this with him.
Oh, okay. Well, thanks. He can go back to holding if he's not ready to talk.
Okay.
And from that point, we collect his personal effects, which was a large duffel bag.
And inside the duffel bag is a shocking new piece of evidence.
It was very strange. I've never come across anything like that before in my career.
He was trying to turn this whole situation into an action-adventure novel.
After a week on the lam, authorities have finally apprehended fugitive James Ray after he murdered his girlfriend, Angela Bledsoe, and fled to Cuba.
James Ray was public enemy number 1.
He gets to the police station and he refuses to offer a statement.
However, after going through his belongings, police discover something just as valuable.
Inside that bag, we're able to locate a 20-page manifesto that he had handwritten. It was very strange. I've never come across anything like that before in my career.
In it, James wrote about everything that happened, as if it was some adventure novel. He even said it deserved to be published and the proceeds should go to his daughter.
The manifesto, entitled On the Move, features main characters named Jack and Mousie instead of James and Angela.
It was a little odd reading the manifesto in another name and like a third-type person.
In the manifesto, James echoes a similar version of events as those in the confession letter.
The differences between the typed letter that James Ray left behind and the manifesto that we recovered off of him when he was returned to the United States is that the typed letter was short and it left out a lot of detail. The handwritten journal, it was clear. He spent a lot of time thinking about what he was going to say.
James sticks to the claim that a heated argument had erupted while he was trying to clean his guns. But this time, his story is slightly different. He claims the bickering with Angela started after dropping their daughter off at school that morning.
After their heated discussion, they went their separate ways. Angela said she had errands to run.
You know what? I'm out of here.
So he felt it was a perfect time to clean all of his guns So he removed him from his safe, and he brought him down, placed him on the glass coffee table in the living room.
He gets up to go to the bathroom.
When he walked back into the living room, James claims Angela was sitting on the couch holding one of his guns.
She rants and raves about how things aren't working.
Be careful with that.
I can't do this anymore, James.
According to James, that's when his military training kicked in, and he picked up another weapon, firing in Angela's direction as he ran for cover.
Like out of some Rambo movie, it becomes a shootout where he's in survival mode.
He claims that he ran into the bathroom and hid.
And he says it feels like he was there for an eternity, and he comes out because it was quiet.
When he came out, he saw a trail of blood leading into the kitchen. He goes into the kitchen and he sees Angela on the floor. When she sees him, she raises up the gun to shoot at him.
He goes into fight or flight mode and just shoots wildly because he's got to defend himself, because she's been there, poised and ready to just take him out.
When all the dust settles, he claims he goes up and checks on her. She's not breathing.
He goes into what do I do next mode, which then is when he decides to pack up his stuff, to pack up his daughter's stuff, to assemble all of the things that ended up in the suitcase that Doug had.
He then retrieved his daughter from school and went to meet Doug Pearson.
After dropping his daughter off, he then went to Newark Airport.
James knew police would be looking for his car, so he abandoned it at the Newark Airport.
From Newark Airport, he then took a taxi to Philadelphia, where he stayed a couple days. And during this whole time, from what the letter stated, he was in possession of the murder weapon.
He stayed a night living amongst the homeless, and then began to meticulously dismantle the gun and distribute it around town so that the gun in its entirety couldn't be found.
From there, James hitched rides traveling southbound, eventually landing in Texas.
He then takes a bus from Texas to Mexico, where he would have been under the radar. It is in Mexico that he takes a flight from Mexico to Cuba, which then sends off the bells and whistles.
When detectives finish reading James's manifesto, they're stunned.
We all looked at each other afterward and say, listen, there's no way that his story from the manifesto that she was the aggressor is in any way, shape, or form true. The crime scene was staged. We all had that gut feeling from the moment we walked in the door that there was something wrong here.
This was nothing close to self-defense. It was not passion, provocation, manslaughter. This was a straight-up, cold-blooded murder.
But will justice ever be served in this sensational case?
COVID-19 hits. And so even though James Ray is locked up, the world is locked down.
In the fall of 2018, Montclair police finally have attorney James Ray in custody for the murder of his live-in girlfriend, Angela Bledsoe. But bringing James to justice will be easier said than done.
COVID-19 hits. And so the trial for James Ray for the murder of Angela Bledsoe just keeps getting pushed around simply because the courts can't open. Even though James Ray is locked up, the world is locked down.
It took 4 years for this case to actually go to trial.
Finally, in March of 2023, James Ray's trial begins in a packed Essex County courtroom. Prosecutors open their case by painting the portrait of the real man behind James's facade.
He was just a real controlling, narcissistic man who wanted to keep her in her place and was really taken back that she didn't want to be with him anymore.
As an example of his spiraling behavior, prosecutors play a recording of a phone call James made to a friend just hours after the shooting.
Hear me out. She says, oh, she's upset and annoyed because 5 years ago, I wasn't available to be there with her when she was pregnant. I said, I was married, you know that. Yeah, but you didn't show that you cared. What?
he rants about everything, about her infidelity, about his state of being, about how he just couldn't take it anymore, and he seemed unhinged.
Though he never outright admits to his friend that he killed Angela, he does make some cryptic implications.
I'm going to speak in generalities, and it's going to sound scary, but don't get scared.
Okay.
Sometimes you have to protect people in a way that's unconventional.
What, the things you go through to protect people, you're saying?
Yes, you really do.
Following the cryptic phone call, prosecutors bring in a ballistics expert to debunk the story James told in his manifesto.
We were asked to look at the case, the evidence of the case, and we were able to determine what we believed was the sequence of events that occurred that evening.
Experts conclude that the crime scene isn't consistent with a shootout, but rather an execution, starting in the living room.
James, we need to talk. I found a house, and I'm moving out.
No, you're not going anywhere.
What do you mean? What are you doing, James?
Ms. Bledsoe received a gunshot wound to the front of her upper torso. That projectile exited her back. The projectile then lodged in the backrest cushion of the sofa.
She then gets up, and we know that because there's a bloody handprint on the armrest, and then there's a trail of blood that starts to lead from the living room into the kitchen.
Experts believe Angela was crawling into the kitchen when James fired the second shot.
At some point between where she was first shot and her final resting position, she received additional gunfire, and that gunshot came into her back.
She had to have been shot in the back prior to coming to her final resting position because her final resting position was on her back.
Fighting for her life, Angela was able to turn over for one last look at her former lover as he stood over her and fired the final shot.
There was nowhere else he could have been except standing right over her when he delivered that gunshot. So the ballistics in this case and the wound paths completely demolished any claim of self-defense that James Ray was trying to assert.
Question has to be asked, just from any investigative standpoint. You're holding a firearm in your hand. You've already fired the firearm. You've already struck the individual. If you're that much in fear, why don't you leave?
He could have went to the neighbors and he could have called for help. He didn't do anything like that.
Frankly, Mr. Ray gave us everything we needed to disprove his claim of self-defense. When he left the crime scene the way it was, Mr. Ray helped us actually prove our case beyond a reasonable doubt that it was in fact an intentional, knowing murder.
After a 7-week trial, it only takes the jury 3 hours to reach a verdict.
He was found guilty of first-degree murder, and it was just sheer joy, sheer elation.
But just a few days before James is due to face a sentencing of up to life in prison, the story takes one last shocking turn.
On June 18, 2023, Father's Day, James Ray was found unresponsive in his cell at Essex County Correctional Facility.
James is rushed to the hospital, but it's too late. He's pronounced dead from a drug overdose.
It kind of brings disappointment to the investigation, to the prosecution, and also to the family itself.
He needed to hear the impact statements, and they wanted to let them know what they felt. And he ducked what he needed to hear from the loved ones.
Justice fell a little short for the Bledsoe family, and that's too bad. They deserve better. But in everybody's mind, he was convicted. That's the most important thing, is that everybody knows that James Ray did not go to his grave an innocent man.
It's a shame that a woman who had so much potential and already proved so much success and so much knowledge had to end in this way because of a lover.
A mom lost her life, a daughter lost her mom, and years later, the daughter loses her father.
With domestic cases, people that are left behind are the ones that really get hurt the most. All these other family members have to suffer now for the rest of their lifetime.
Domestic violence does not discriminate. You could be successful, you could be educated, and it could still come to your doorstep. Listen to yourself and the voice inside your head that says, maybe this relationship is toxic. Just be safe and get out of the relationship.
On the morning of October 3rd, Sill, 1984, life unfolded as it always had in the quiet community of Queensville, Ontario. Nestled among farmland and small residential roads about an hour north of Toronto, the village was the kind of place where neighbors knew one another. Children rode their bicycles without fear, and parents believed the surrounding countryside offered a safe environment to grow up. It was a community defined by familiarity, routine, and trust. That sense of security would be shattered before the day was over. 9-year-old Christine Jessup was an energetic and creative child with a vivid imagination. She enjoyed drawing, reading, and spending time with her family. Friends and relatives remembered her as cheerful and curious, a young girl who was comfortable exploring her neighborhood and who was looking forward to the ordinary moments of childhood that so often go unnoticed until they are suddenly taken away. On that Wednesday afternoon, nothing suggested that history was about to remember her name for one of Canada's most enduring criminal investigations. Christine had returned home after school as usual. Her mother was away at work, while other family members expected the afternoon to pass without incident. At some point after arriving home, Christine left the house. Investigators would later determine that she likely intended to visit a nearby location familiar to her, a route she had traveled before. She never returned. As the afternoon stretched into evening, concern quickly turned into alarm. Family members searched nearby roads, neighboring properties, and places where children often gathered. Friends and neighbors joined the effort almost immediately. In a close-knit rural community, news traveled quickly, and within hours, dozens of volunteers were walking fields, checking wooded areas, and calling Christine's name into the growing darkness. When local searches produced no sign of the 9-year-old, police were notified, and what had begun as a missing child investigation rapidly became one of the largest search operations the region had ever experienced. Officers from multiple agencies arrived to coordinate efforts. Search teams expanded their coverage well beyond the immediate neighborhood. Dogs trained in tracking human scent were deployed. Helicopters flew overhead. Every passing hour increased investigators' concern. For families watching the news that evening, the disappearance felt deeply personal. Canada had experienced missing children cases before, but each one carried the same haunting question: how could someone vanish so completely in broad daylight? Investigators immediately began reconstructing Christine's final known movements. They interviewed classmates, teachers, neighbors, motorists, and anyone who might have seen a young girl walking along local roads during the afternoon. Every reported sighting was carefully evaluated. Some witnesses believed they had seen Christine walking alone. Others recalled unfamiliar vehicles in the area, although many descriptions conflicted with one another. Detectives faced the difficult task common to missing person investigations: separating reliable observations from memories influenced by rumor or hindsight. Inside the Jessup family home, the uncertainty became unbearable. Every telephone call carried hope. Every knock at the door raised expectations that police had found Christine alive. Yet hour after hour, there was no breakthrough. As days passed, the search continued across forests, abandoned buildings, drainage ditches, and farmland. Hundreds of volunteers participated alongside law enforcement officers. Newspapers throughout Ontario carried Christine's photograph. Television broadcasts appealed directly to viewers for information. Her smiling school portrait became instantly recognizable across the country. Despite the enormous effort, investigators remained confronted by an unsettling reality. There was almost no physical evidence explaining what had happened. There were no confirmed eyewitnesses who had seen an abduction occur. No obvious crime scene had been identified. The investigation depended almost entirely upon interviews, timelines, and public cooperation. 3 months later, on December 31st, Sill, 1984, the search reached a heartbreaking conclusion. Christine's body was discovered in a wooded area near Sunderland, Ontario, roughly 50 kilometers from where she had disappeared. The location was isolated, making it unlikely that anyone would have stumbled upon it sooner. The discovery transformed the investigation from a missing child case into a homicide investigation. For investigators, the scene presented both opportunities and challenges. Forensic specialists carefully documented every available detail, collecting physical evidence using the scientific standards available during the mid-1980s. While important evidence was recovered, forensic technology at the time was far more limited than what investigators would possess decades later. DNA profiling was still in its infancy and not yet a practical investigative tool in Canada. Detectives understood that preserving every piece of evidence might one day prove critical, even if contemporary science could not fully analyze it. The murder shocked the nation. Media coverage intensified dramatically. Parents across Canada questioned how such a crime could occur in what appeared to be an ordinary rural community. Schools discussed child safety with renewed urgency. Communities organized neighborhood watch programs. Christine Jessup's name became associated with a broader national conversation about protecting children from violent crime. Police assembled a large investigative team. Hundreds of interviews became thousands. Tips poured in from across Ontario. Detectives examined known offenders, individuals with histories of violence, and anyone believed to have had contact with Christine before her disappearance. Every possible lead demanded attention. One individual quickly attracted investigative scrutiny. Guy Paul Morin, a local resident who lived near the Jessup family, became a significant focus of the investigation. Although Morin consistently denied any involvement and maintained his innocence, investigators developed a theory placing him at the center of the crime. The case against him relied heavily upon circumstantial evidence, witness recollections, and forensic interpretations that would later become the subject of intense criticism. Years of legal proceedings followed. Morin was initially acquitted in 1986, but prosecutors appealed, leading to a second trial. In 1992, he was convicted of Christine Jessup's murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. To many observers, it appeared the case had been solved. Yet beneath the surface, serious questions persisted. Members of Morin's defense team challenged both the forensic evidence and aspects of the police investigation. Independent experts questioned scientific conclusions presented during trial. Concerns emerged regarding tunnel vision, the tendency for investigators to become increasingly focused on one suspect while unintentionally overlooking alternative explanations. These concerns gained greater significance during the 1990s as DNA analysis evolved into a powerful forensic tool. Biological evidence preserved from the original investigation was re-examined using techniques unavailable during the original trials. The results fundamentally changed the direction of the case. In 1995, DNA testing conclusively excluded Guy Paul Morin as the source of critical biological evidence recovered during the investigation. The implications were extraordinary. After spending years imprisoned for a crime he did not commit, Morin's conviction was overturned, and he was formally acquitted. His release marked one of the most significant wrongful conviction cases in Canadian legal history and prompted widespread examination of investigative practices, forensic science, and the criminal justice system. A public inquiry later examined how the investigation and prosecution had gone so dramatically wrong. The resulting report documented numerous investigative failures and offered recommendations that would influence policing practices across Canada for years to come. But one devastating fact remained unchanged. Christine Jessup's real killer had never been identified. The investigation returned to where it had begun, an unsolved child homicide with thousands of documents, countless interviews, preserved forensic evidence, and a family that had now endured more than a decade without answers. Detectives refused to close the file. Evidence was carefully maintained. Advances in forensic science offered hope that one day the preserved biological material might reveal what investigators in 1984 simply could not see. For the Jessup family, however, scientific possibility offered little comfort against the weight of passing years. Birthdays came and went. Anniversaries of Christine's disappearance returned each October. New generations grew up, knowing her story only through newspaper archives and television documentaries. The little girl whose smile had once appeared on missing person posters had become the enduring face of one of Canada's most haunting cold cases. A reminder that while investigations can stall, the search for truth does not necessarily end with time. Following the exoneration of Guy Paul Morin in 1995, investigators found themselves confronting one of the most difficult realities in criminal justice: a homicide case that had consumed enormous public resources, resulted in the wrongful conviction of an innocent man, and still had no identified perpetrator. For Christine Jessup's family, the legal correction represented an important acknowledgement that a grave injustice had occurred, but it did not answer the question that had remained unchanged since October 1984. Who had abducted and murdered 9-year-old Christine Jessup? The years immediately following Morin's acquittal were marked by careful reassessment rather than dramatic breakthroughs. The Ontario Provincial Police, OP, reviewed thousands of investigative records accumulated over more than a decade. Detectives revisited witness statements, timelines, physical evidence, and forensic reports, attempting to separate reliable facts from assumptions that had influenced earlier stages of the investigation. One of the most significant consequences of the case was the establishment of the Commission on Proceedings involving Guy Paul Morin, led by the Honorable Fred Kaufman, commonly referred to as the Kaufman Inquiry. The Commission conducted an extensive examination of the investigation and prosecution. Its mandate extended beyond determining why Morin had been wrongfully convicted. It also sought to identify systemic weaknesses that might affect future criminal investigations across Canada. The inquiry heard testimony from police officers, forensic scientists, prosecutors, defense lawyers, and independent experts. Thousands of pages of evidence were reviewed. The final report, released in 1998, became one of the most influential documents in Canadian criminal justice reform. Among its findings was the concept of tunnel vision, a phenomenon in which investigators or prosecutors become so convinced of a suspect's guilt that alternative explanations receive insufficient attention. The report concluded that this cognitive bias had played a substantial role in the Morin investigation. Once detectives became focused on Morin, evidence inconsistent with that theory was sometimes minimized or interpreted in ways that reinforced existing assumptions. The inquiry also highlighted shortcomings in forensic science as it existed during the 1980s. Certain forms of evidence analysis presented confidently during the original investigation were later shown to be less reliable than previously believed. Hair comparison techniques, fiber analysis, and witness memory all carried limitations that were not fully appreciated at the time. Perhaps most importantly, the inquiry emphasized the growing importance of DNA evidence. By the late 1990s, DNA profiling had already transformed criminal investigations around the world. Cases that once depended heavily on circumstantial evidence could now be reassessed using biological material preserved decades earlier. In Christine Jessup's case, the preservation of forensic evidence from 1984 would ultimately prove invaluable. Even so, technology alone could not immediately identify the killer. Investigators possessed a DNA profile from the unknown perpetrator, but throughout the late 1990s and early 2000s, searches against Canadian criminal DNA databases failed to produce a match. This outcome suggested several possibilities. The offender might never have been convicted of another offense requiring DNA collection. He could have died before national databases expanded. He might have left Canada or simply avoided detection altogether. Each unsuccessful search reinforced the case's status as a true cold case. Cold cases differ fundamentally from active investigations. Instead of daily interviews and fresh crime scenes, detectives work with historical records, aging evidence, and memories that inevitably fade over time. Witnesses relocate or die. Physical locations change. Businesses close. Roads are reconstructed. The passage of time can erase opportunities while simultaneously creating new ones through scientific advancement. The AP maintained a dedicated commitment to preserving the Jessup investigation despite these challenges. Detectives periodically reopened lines of inquiry as new forensic methods emerged. Biological samples were carefully stored under conditions that would preserve their evidentiary value for future testing. Every technological improvement offered another opportunity to extract information unavailable to earlier investigators. Meanwhile, Christine Jessup's family continued to live with profound loss. Public attention naturally shifted toward newer criminal cases, yet for those closest to Christine, the investigation never truly became history. Interviews given by family members over the years consistently reflected the emotional complexity of their situation. They had experienced the disappearance of a child, the discovery of her murder, years of legal proceedings, the apparent resolution of the case, the realization that the convicted individual was innocent, and finally, the reopening of a mystery that many believed had already been solved. The emotional burden extended beyond the immediate family. The wrongful conviction of Guy Paul Morin profoundly affected public confidence in the criminal justice system. Morin himself emerged from years of legal proceedings carrying the consequences of being publicly identified as a child murderer despite his innocence. His experience became one of Canada's most significant examples of the lasting human cost of wrongful convictions. The broader legal community also absorbed important lessons. Police agencies across Canada incorporated recommendations addressing investigative bias, disclosure obligations, forensic standards, and major case management. Training programs increasingly emphasized objective evidence evaluation and the necessity of continually reassessing investigative theories. Ironically, one of the most enduring legacies of Christine Jessup's case was not only its tragedy, but also its contribution to improving investigative practices nationwide. Throughout the early 2000s, DNA technology continued advancing at an extraordinary pace. Scientists developed increasingly sensitive methods capable of producing reliable profiles from smaller and more degraded biological samples. Automated laboratory procedures improved accuracy while reducing processing time. International cooperation expanded forensic databases, allowing investigators to compare evidence across jurisdictions more efficiently than ever before. Yet despite these developments, one critical limitation remained. Traditional DNA databases could identify only individuals whose genetic profiles had already been entered into the system through prior criminal convictions or authorized collections. If an unknown offender had never submitted DNA to a database, no match could be generated regardless of how accurate the biological evidence might be. For Christine Jessup's investigation, this limitation proved frustratingly persistent. Periodic reviews produced no confirmed suspect. Potential leads continued to be evaluated whenever new information emerged. Detectives received occasional tips from members of the public who believed they had information about suspicious individuals or forgotten observations dating back to 1984. Every credible lead required careful assessment, even when decades had passed since the crime. Investigators also continued examining individuals who had lived, worked, or traveled through the region during the time of Christine's disappearance. Historical employment records, residential information, vehicle ownership documents, and previous investigative files were analyzed with increasing sophistication. By the second decade of the 21st century, another revolutionary forensic approach began attracting international attention. Known as investigative genetic genealogy, the method differed fundamentally from conventional DNA database searches. Rather than seeking an exact match within criminal databases, investigators could compare crime scene DNA to profiles voluntarily submitted by individuals researching their family ancestry through commercial genealogy services, subject to legal and privacy requirements applicable at the time. The approach first gained widespread recognition after helping identify suspects in several long unsolved American investigations, including the Golden State Killer case, announced publicly in 2018. Law enforcement agencies around the world watched these developments closely. Canadian investigators recognized that the same scientific principles might eventually assist unresolved domestic cases, particularly those involving preserved biological evidence and unidentified offenders whose DNA had never entered criminal databases. Christine Jessup's case appeared to fit precisely that description. Still, applying investigative genetic genealogy presented substantial legal, ethical, and practical challenges. Policies regarding privacy, consent, laboratory procedures, and judicial authorization required careful development before such techniques could be used in Canadian investigations. Cold case detectives remained patient. The history of the Jessup investigation had already demonstrated the dangers of moving too quickly toward conclusions unsupported by reliable evidence. If new technology were to be used, it would need to withstand the highest scientific and legal scrutiny. Behind the scenes, forensic laboratories continued preserving and validating the biological evidence collected in 1984. The DNA profile remained intact, waiting for investigative methods capable of transforming anonymous genetic information into a name. As years passed, anniversaries of Christine's disappearance continued to receive media attention. Newspapers revisited the investigation each October. Television documentaries examined both the homicide and the wrongful conviction of Guy Paul Morin. The public increasingly viewed the case not simply as an unsolved murder, but as a symbol of both the fallibility and resilience of the justice system. For detectives assigned to the investigation, however, symbolism offered little satisfaction. A child had been murdered. Her family still lacked answers. A DNA profile existed. Somewhere, that profile belonged to a real individual whose identity remained hidden. The challenge was no longer determining whether biological evidence existed. The challenge was discovering the name attached to it, a task that investigators hoped emerging scientific methods might finally accomplish after decades of uncertainty. By the late 2010s, the investigation into the murder of Christine Jessup had entered its 35th year. Few criminal cases remain active for so long without exhausting every traditional investigative avenue. Yet the Ontario Provincial Police continued to preserve the file as an open homicide investigation. Detectives understood that while witnesses could disappear and memories could fade, properly preserved forensic evidence retained the potential to answer questions that earlier generations of investigators had been unable to resolve. During this period, developments outside Canada were transforming the field of cold case investigation. In the United States, investigators had begun solving decades-old murders through a process known as investigative genetic genealogy. Unlike conventional DNA database searches, which compare an unknown DNA profile against samples collected from convicted offenders or authorized criminal databases, investigative genetic genealogy uses publicly available or voluntarily submitted genealogical information, subject to legal and privacy rules, to identify biological relatives of an unknown individual. Those relationships can then be used to construct family trees, gradually narrowing the pool of possible suspects. The technique attracted international attention in 2018 when it helped identify a suspect in the Golden State Killer investigation, one of the most notorious serial crime cases in American history. For police agencies around the world, the success demonstrated that a DNA profile with no direct match could still lead investigators toward an individual through distant familial connections. Canadian investigators followed these developments with considerable interest. The Christine Jessup case possessed characteristics that made it a strong candidate for such an approach. Investigators had preserved biological evidence from the original crime scene. DNA analysis conducted years earlier had already excluded Guy Paul Morin and confirmed that the evidence belonged to an unidentified male. The primary obstacle was no longer scientific analysis of the sample itself, but identifying the person from whom that DNA originated. Before any new investigative strategy could proceed, however, authorities needed to ensure that every legal and scientific safeguard was in place. Investigative genetic genealogy was still a relatively new technique. Questions concerning privacy, consent, admissibility of evidence, and investigative procedure required careful consideration. Canadian law enforcement agencies approached the method cautiously, recognizing both its remarkable potential and the responsibility accompanying its use. Specialized forensic scientists worked alongside experienced investigators to evaluate whether the preserved biological evidence met the technical requirements for genealogical analysis. Samples collected in 1984 had already undergone previous rounds of testing over several decades. Advances in laboratory technology made it possible to obtain increasingly detailed genetic information from material that had once been considered too limited or degraded for sophisticated examination. As preparations continued, detectives also revisited the enormous body of investigative records accumulated since Christine's disappearance. The case file contained thousands of pages documenting interviews, search efforts, forensic reports, maps, photographs, laboratory analyses, court proceedings, and correspondence. Every document represented a moment in an investigation that had spanned generations of police officers. Some detectives assigned to the case in the late 2010s had not yet begun their policing careers when Christine disappeared in 1984. Their understanding of the investigation depended upon meticulous record-keeping by those who came before them. Cold case investigations often require investigators to approach historical evidence with fresh perspective. Earlier detectives may have concentrated on certain theories based upon information available at the time. Modern investigators, informed by decades of additional experience and improved scientific knowledge, can sometimes recognize patterns or opportunities previously overlooked. Importantly, the renewed investigation did not begin with assumptions regarding any particular suspect. The experience of the Guy Paul Morin case had permanently influenced investigative philosophy. Detectives were determined to allow objective evidence to guide the investigation rather than attempting to fit evidence into preconceived theories. The Kaufman Inquiry's recommendations concerning investigative bias remain central to modern case management practices. As forensic specialists prepared the DNA evidence for genealogical analysis, investigators also assembled historical information concerning individuals connected to the region where Christine had disappeared. Residential records, employment histories, property ownership documents, historical maps, and archived public records became increasingly valuable. Should genealogy identify potential family groups, detectives would need historical context to determine whether any individuals within those families could plausibly have been connected to the investigation in 1984. Genealogical analysis itself is a painstaking process rather than a single laboratory test. The unknown DNA profile is compared against databases containing individuals who have voluntarily shared genetic information for ancestry research, subject to the database's policies and applicable laws. Direct matches are uncommon. Instead, investigators often identify distant relatives, perhaps third or fourth cousins sharing relatively small portions of DNA. Professional genealogists then begin constructing extensive family trees. Birth records, marriage certificates, census data, obituary notices, military records, immigration documents, newspaper archives, cemetery records, and countless other historical sources may be consulted. The objective is to identify common ancestors shared by the distant genetic relatives. From those ancestors, researchers work forward through multiple generations, documenting descendants while gradually narrowing possibilities based upon age, sex, geographic location, and other known investigative facts. The process requires extraordinary attention to detail. Large families can produce hundreds or even thousands of descendants across several generations. Every branch must be evaluated carefully. A single mistaken assumption can send researchers down entirely incorrect family lines. For this reason, investigative genetic genealogy combines advanced molecular science with traditional archival historical research. Although much of this work occurs quietly behind the scenes, it often represents months of meticulous effort before investigators identify individuals warranting further examination. In Christine Jessup's case, investigators eventually succeeded in identifying a family line that appeared consistent with the unknown DNA profile. From there, detectives began applying traditional investigative methods. They reviewed historical records to determine which family members had lived in Ontario during the relevant period. Ages were compared with the likely age of the offender in 1984. Employment histories were examined. Residential addresses were mapped against locations significant to the investigation. Travel patterns, criminal histories where applicable, and known associations all became part of a systematic evaluation. At this stage, genealogy did not establish guilt. Instead, it generated investigative leads requiring independent corroboration. One individual gradually emerged as particularly significant. His name was Calvin Hoover. Hoover had lived in Ontario at the time of Christine's disappearance and possessed historical connections that investigators considered relevant to the investigation. Importantly, however, he had died in 2015, years before genealogy identified him as a potential suspect. Because Hoover was deceased, investigators could not interview him or obtain a contemporary DNA sample directly. Instead, they turned to preserved biological material collected during his lifetime. Authorities lawfully obtained a biological sample associated with Hoover and submitted it for forensic comparison against the DNA recovered during the original homicide investigation. The laboratory analysis was straightforward but critically important. Scientists compared the preserved crime scene DNA profile with Hoover's biological sample using modern forensic techniques developed over decades of scientific advancement. The result was unequivocal. The DNA profile matched. For investigators who had spent years pursuing anonymous genetic evidence, the laboratory confirmation represented a profound turning point. After more than 3 decades, the unknown DNA recovered from Christine Jessup's murder no longer belonged to an unidentified individual. It belonged to Calvin Hoover. Yet even at this stage, investigators proceeded cautiously. DNA evidence can establish biological association with extraordinary reliability, but responsible homicide investigations seek corroboration wherever possible. Detectives continued examining Hoover's background, movements, and historical connections to determine whether independent evidence aligned with the forensic findings. Historical records revealed that Hoover had lived relatively close to the Jessup family during the period of Christine's disappearance. Investigators also determined that he had worked as an air conditioning technician whose employment brought him into residential neighborhoods throughout the region. While these facts did not independently establish criminal responsibility, they demonstrated opportunities for familiarity with local communities. Detectives also considered whether Hoover had previously attracted investigative attention in 1984. The answer appeared to be no. Unlike Guy Paul Morin, Hoover had never become a central investigative focus during the original investigation. His name had not emerged prominently during decades of public discussion surrounding the case. This fact illustrated both the strengths and limitations of traditional investigative methods. Without DNA and genealogy, there had been little reason to identify Hoover among thousands of possible individuals. Modern forensic science had succeeded where decades of conventional investigation had not. Still, because Hoover had died years earlier, prosecutors could never present the evidence before a criminal court. There would be no trial, no cross-examination, and no criminal verdict. Instead, investigators concentrated on ensuring that every scientific conclusion met the highest evidentiary standards before informing Christine Jessup's family and the Canadian public. For detectives who had inherited the investigation from previous generations, the moment carried mixed emotions. The identification represented an extraordinary investigative achievement. It also underscored the passage of time. That Christine had been murdered in 1984. Her killer had lived for more than 30 years without criminal accountability for that crime. By the time science finally revealed his identity, he was already beyond the reach of the criminal justice system. Even so, investigators recognized that identifying the offender mattered profoundly. It corrected the historical record, provided long-awaited answers to Christine's family, affirmed the innocence of Guy Paul Morin through independent evidence, and demonstrated how scientific progress could restore truth even when conventional justice was no longer possible. The confirmation that the DNA recovered from Christine Jessup's murder matched Calvin Hoover marked the beginning of a new phase of the investigation rather than its conclusion. In modern homicide investigations, especially those involving decades-old evidence, investigators do not rely on a single scientific result in isolation. Every significant finding must be carefully examined alongside historical records, witness statements, physical evidence, and the known timeline of events. Detectives now face the responsibility of determining whether the broader body of evidence supported the DNA findings and whether any alternative explanation remained plausible. The Ontario Provincial Police assembled investigators, forensic specialists, and legal advisors to conduct a comprehensive review. Their objective was not simply to announce that a DNA match had been found. They sought to ensure that every conclusion could withstand the same level of scrutiny expected in a criminal prosecution, even though Calvin Hoover had died in 2015 and could no longer face trial. The review began with Hoover's background. Born in 1948, Calvin Hoover had been 36 years old at the time. Christine disappeared in October 1984. He lived in Ontario and worked as an air conditioning technician, a profession that regularly brought him into residential neighborhoods throughout the Greater Toronto Area and surrounding communities. Employment records indicated that his work involved travel to private homes and businesses, making it entirely possible for him to have been familiar with communities outside his immediate place of residence. Investigators also examined whether Hoover had any documented relationship with the Jessup family. No evidence was found suggesting that he knew Christine personally or had any established connection with her family. This was consistent with what investigators had suspected from the beginning. Cases involving child abductions are often committed by offenders who exploit brief opportunities rather than long-standing personal relationships. While every case differs, investigators had never established that Christine was targeted because of a prior acquaintance. Attention then returned to the day of Christine's disappearance. Detectives reconstructed the known timeline using original investigative records, witness interviews, and modern analytical methods. Christine had arrived home after school during the afternoon of October 3, Sill, 1984. She left the house sometime afterward and was believed to have been walking along a familiar route within her community. Multiple witnesses reported seeing a young girl matching Christine's description, although the precise sequence of sightings remained difficult to establish with certainty. As had been recognized during the original investigation, no eyewitness directly observed the abduction itself. This absence of direct observation was one reason the investigation had proven so difficult for decades. Without surveillance cameras, mobile phone records, GPS data, or widespread digital evidence technologies unavailable in 1984, investigators had relied almost entirely on physical evidence and human recollection. Those limitations shaped every stage of the original inquiry. Now, with Hoover identified through DNA, detectives reconsidered witness information from a different perspective. They reviewed reports describing unfamiliar vehicles seen in the area, individuals whose identities had never been established, and observations that had received limited attention during the original investigation. Although the passage of time prevented definitive resolution of every historical detail, investigators found nothing inconsistent with Hoover's potential involvement. Equally important was what they did not find. There was no evidence implicating any other individual whose DNA could explain the biological material recovered during the homicide investigation. The preserved forensic evidence consistently pointed toward a single unidentified male, and modern testing had now identified that individual as Calvin Hoover. Detectives also considered Hoover's history more broadly. Unlike some offenders identified through cold case investigations, Hoover had not accumulated a lengthy criminal record for violent offenses that would have drawn sustained law enforcement attention. Publicly available records did not reveal a pattern of convictions comparable to those seen in many serial violent offenders. This relative lack of documented criminal history helps explain why he had remained outside the primary focus of investigators in 1984. The identification, therefore, underscored an important investigative lesson. Not every offender responsible for a major crime has an obvious history that immediately attracts police attention. Some remain largely unknown to law enforcement, blending into ordinary communities and maintaining outwardly conventional lives while concealing serious criminal conduct. As investigators prepared to disclose their findings publicly, another priority emerged: informing Christine Jessup's surviving family members. For families affected by homicide, official notification is among the most sensitive responsibilities investigators undertake. In this case, the conversation carried extraordinary emotional complexity. Christine's family had lived through the initial disappearance, the discovery of her body, years of uncertainty, the prosecution and eventual exoneration of Guy Paul Moran, and more than 3 decades of unanswered questions. They had experienced hope, disappointment, public scrutiny, and prolonged grief unlike that faced by most victims' families. Now investigators were able to explain that modern forensic science had identified the source of the unknown DNA recovered from the investigation. Although the announcement could not restore Christine's life or provide the opportunity for a criminal trial, it answered the central question that had remained unresolved for 36 years: who had been responsible? In October 2020, the Ontario Provincial Police publicly announced the results of their investigation. At a news conference, officials explained that advances in DNA technology and investigative genetic genealogy had identified Calvin Hoover as the person whose DNA matched biological evidence collected during the investigation. Because Hoover had died in 2015, no criminal charges could be filed. Nevertheless, investigators stated that the evidence established his responsibility for Christine Jessup's murder. The announcement received widespread attention throughout Canada. For many Canadians, the case had become familiar not only because of the murder itself, but because of the wrongful conviction of Guy Paul Moran. News organizations revisited the investigation from its beginning, tracing the extraordinary journey from a missing child report in 1984 to a scientific breakthrough more than 3 decades later. The public reaction reflected a mixture of emotions. Many expressed relief that Christine's family finally had answers after decades of uncertainty. Others reflected upon the tragedy that the identification had come after Hoover's death, making criminal prosecution impossible. Many also revisited the profound consequences experienced by Guy Paul Morin, whose wrongful conviction had permanently altered his life despite his eventual exoneration. Legal experts noted that the case illustrated both the remarkable progress of forensic science and the importance of maintaining objective investigative standards. DNA had not merely solved an old homicide, it had corrected a historical injustice while identifying the actual perpetrator through evidence unavailable to investigators in 1984. Forensic scientists likewise viewed the investigation as a significant demonstration of technological advancement. The biological evidence collected decades earlier had been preserved carefully enough to benefit from scientific methods that did not exist when Christine was murdered. Had that evidence been lost, contaminated, or improperly stored, the identification might never have been possible. The case therefore reinforced the critical importance of evidence preservation in every homicide investigation, regardless of the technological limitations existing at the time. The investigation also contributed to broader discussions concerning investigative genetic genealogy. Supporters emphasized its extraordinary potential to solve violent crimes that had resisted conventional investigative methods for decades. Privacy advocates encouraged careful oversight regarding the use of genealogical information and voluntary DNA databases. Canadian authorities stressed that such techniques must operate within legal frameworks designed to balance effective law enforcement with individual privacy rights. For the Ontario Provincial Police, however, the immediate significance remained deeply personal. The detectives responsible for the investigation understood that their work represented the culmination of efforts begun by officers who had responded to Christine's disappearance in October 1984. Many original investigators had retired, some had passed away, yet the preserved evidence, meticulous documentation, and determination of successive generations of investigators had ultimately made identification possible. Christine Jessup's case had become one of Canada's most important examples of perseverance in cold case investigation. It demonstrated that the passage of time does not necessarily diminish the possibility of solving serious crimes. Scientific progress can transform evidence once considered insufficient into decisive investigative leads. At the same time, the case illustrated the limits of justice delayed. Although truth had finally emerged, the opportunity to present evidence before a court had been lost years earlier with Hoover's death. Even so, investigators emphasized that identifying the offender remained profoundly important. Families deserve answers. Historical records deserve accuracy. Innocent individuals deserve exoneration, supported by objective evidence. And future investigations benefit when lessons learned from difficult cases improve policing practices for generations to come. The murder of Christine Jessup forever changed the lives of her family, reshaped Canadian criminal justice through the lessons of the Morin wrongful conviction, and demonstrated the transformative power of forensic science. While no announcement could erase decades of grief, the identification of Calvin Hoover finally replaced uncertainty with evidence, a conclusion reached not through speculation or assumption, but through the careful application of modern science to evidence preserved by investigators who believed, even in 1984, that one day the truth might finally be uncovered. The identification of Calvin Hoover in October 2020 marked the formal conclusion of one of Canada's longest-running homicide investigations, but for many people connected to the case, it also represented the beginning of a broader conversation about justice, science, and the enduring responsibilities of the criminal justice system. Solving a case after more than 3 decades is not simply a matter of attaching a name to a DNA profile. It requires society to confront difficult questions about what justice means when the offender is no longer alive, when an innocent person has already spent years imprisoned, and when the victim's family has lived through decades of uncertainty before receiving answers. For Christine Jessup's family, the Ontario Provincial Police announcement brought a form of resolution that had remained elusive since October 1984. Although no criminal trial could take place, investigators were finally able to provide an evidence-based explanation for the identity of the man responsible for Christine's murder. Family members publicly acknowledged the importance of finally knowing the truth, while also recognizing that no investigative breakthrough could reverse the loss of a 9-year-old child whose future had been taken away. The emotional impact of cold cases often differs from that of investigations solved quickly. Families whose cases remain unsolved frequently describe living with uncertainty rather than closure. Every anniversary, every media report, and every new investigative development reopens painful memories. Even when scientific advances eventually identify an offender, decades have already passed. Parents grow older. Siblings build lives shaped by an absence that never fully disappears. Friends remember the victim not only as a child, but also as the person they never had the opportunity to become. Christine Jessup's case illustrates this reality with unusual clarity. When Christine disappeared, she was a 4th-grade student living in a rural Ontario community. By the time investigators identified Calvin Hoover through investigative genetic genealogy, an entire generation had grown up knowing her only through newspaper archives, television documentaries, legal textbooks, and discussions of wrongful convictions. Many Canadians born after 1984 first learned about the case because of Guy Paul Moran's exoneration rather than the original investigation itself. As a result, the 2020 announcement reshaped public understanding of the case. For years, discussions surrounding the investigation had focused on 2 parallel narratives: the murder of Christine Jessup and the wrongful conviction of Guy Paul Moran. Those narratives were inseparable because both arose from the same investigation. The DNA identification of Hoover did not erase the significance of Moran's experience. Instead, it completed the historical record by independently confirming that the biological evidence excluded Moran and identified another individual. For Guy Paul Moran, the announcement represented another important public acknowledgement of his innocence. Although DNA testing had already exonerated him in 1995, identifying the actual source of the crime scene DNA provided an additional level of certainty. It demonstrated not only that Moran had been wrongly convicted, but also that investigators now knew whose DNA had been present in the evidence collected during the homicide investigation. Moran's case continues to be studied extensively in Canadian law schools, police academies, and forensic science programs. It serves as a reminder that wrongful convictions can arise from a combination of investigative bias, flawed forensic interpretation, mistaken assumptions, and intense pressure to solve highly publicized crimes. The Kaufman Inquiry's recommendations remain influential decades after their publication, shaping investigative training throughout Canada. Among the inquiry's most enduring lessons is the importance of maintaining an open investigative mindset. Modern major case management emphasizes the continual testing of investigative theories against objective evidence. Detectives are encouraged to challenge their own assumptions, document decision-making processes carefully, and actively consider alternative explanations rather than becoming committed to a single suspect too early in an investigation. These principles are now widely recognized as essential safeguards against the type of tunnel vision identified during the original Jessup investigation. The role of forensic science also evolved dramatically because of cases such as this one. In 1984, DNA profiling had not yet become a practical investigative tool. By the mid-1990s, DNA technology had already overturned a wrongful conviction. By 2020, investigative genetic genealogy had identified the unknown offender despite the absence of a direct database match. Each stage of the investigation reflected the scientific capabilities available at that particular moment in history. This progression demonstrates an important characteristic of forensic science. It is continually developing. Evidence that appears inconclusive today may become highly significant tomorrow as laboratory methods improve. Consequently, modern investigators place enormous emphasis on preserving biological material, digital records, physical exhibits, photographs, and documentation according to rigorous evidentiary standards. The Jessup investigation is frequently cited as an example of why evidence preservation remains essential, even when immediate scientific analysis cannot answer every question. Investigative genetic genealogy itself has become one of the most significant innovations in modern criminal investigation. Rather than replacing traditional detective work, Genealogy functions as an investigative tool that generates leads requiring independent verification. In Christine Jessup's case, genealogical research identified a family line connected to the unknown DNA profile. Detectives then combined historical records, forensic analysis, and additional investigation before concluding that Calvin Hoover was responsible. The final determination relied upon multiple forms of evidence rather than genealogy alone. This distinction remains important within both scientific and legal communities. DNA evidence is extraordinarily powerful, but investigators recognize that every conclusion should be supported by careful analysis of all available information. Responsible investigations avoid treating any single technique as infallible. Instead, forensic findings, witness information, historical documentation, and investigative reasoning are evaluated collectively. Christine Jessup's case has also contributed to ongoing discussions regarding privacy and genetic information. Because investigative genetic genealogy involves the use of voluntarily submitted ancestry data under applicable legal frameworks and database policies, its expansion has prompted careful examination of ethical questions concerning consent, transparency, and oversight. Canadian authorities have emphasized that the technique should be employed under appropriate legal safeguards and only in serious criminal investigations where traditional methods have proven insufficient. These discussions continue internationally as additional jurisdictions adopt or evaluate genealogical investigative methods. Meanwhile, historians of criminal justice increasingly regard the Jessup investigation as a turning point in several respects. It influenced reforms addressing wrongful convictions, demonstrated the importance of forensic evidence preservation, illustrated the dangers of investigative tunnel vision, and showcased the transformative potential of emerging scientific technologies. Few criminal investigations have affected so many aspects of the justice system simultaneously. For the Ontario Provincial Police, the successful identification of Hoover reflected decades of institutional commitment to unresolved homicide investigations. Cold case units exist because investigators recognize that time alone should not determine whether justice remains possible. Advances in science, technology, and information management continually create new opportunities to revisit historical cases. The Jessup investigation demonstrates that persistence can matter as much as innovation. Detectives who announced the identification in 2020 were building upon work begun by investigators in 1984. Every evidence package preserved correctly, every interview documented carefully, every forensic sample maintained under proper conditions, and every investigative record archived accurately contributed to the eventual outcome. Cold case investigations often succeed not because of a single dramatic discovery, but because decades of disciplined evidence preservation allow new technologies to answer old questions. Christine Jessup herself remains at the center of this story. Public attention understandably focused on forensic breakthroughs, legal reforms, and investigative achievements, yet those developments all originated from the loss of a 9-year-old girl whose life ended far too soon. Documentary accounts, public memorials, and educational discussions consistently emphasize that the scientific and legal significance of the case should never overshadow the human tragedy that began it. Remembering Christine as a child, rather than simply as the subject of a criminal investigation, is an important part of understanding the case. She was a daughter, a sister, a student, and a member of a small Ontario community. Her disappearance profoundly affected those who knew her personally long before the case became nationally recognized. Today, the investigation into Christine Jessup's murder occupies a unique place in Canadian history. It is remembered not only as a cold case ultimately solved through investigative genetic genealogy, but also as a case that reshaped investigative practice, strengthened safeguards against wrongful convictions, and demonstrated both the strengths and limitations of the criminal justice system. The offender was identified. The innocent were exonerated. The historical record was corrected. Yet the case continues to remind investigators, lawyers, forensic scientists, and the public that justice is most effective when it is guided by evidence, humility, scientific rigor, and a willingness to revisit past conclusions in light of new facts. Those lessons extend far beyond a single investigation, influencing how future generations approach the difficult task of seeking truth in cases where time, uncertainty, and human error once seemed destined to keep that truth forever out of reach. One of the most lasting legacies of the Christine Jessup investigation is not found solely in the identification of her killer, but in the profound changes the case inspired throughout Canada's criminal justice system. Few homicide investigations have influenced so many aspects of policing, forensic science, prosecution, and judicial oversight. The murder itself was a tragedy. The wrongful conviction that followed exposed critical weaknesses. The eventual identification of Calvin Hoover through modern DNA technology demonstrated how scientific progress could correct historical errors while reinforcing the importance of evidence-based investigation. In the years following the Kaufman inquiry, police agencies across Canada began implementing reforms designed to reduce the risk of investigative tunnel vision. The inquiry had concluded that investigators, acting with sincere intentions, had gradually become convinced that Guy Paul Moran was responsible for Christine's murder. Once that belief took hold, information supporting the theory often received greater attention than evidence that pointed elsewhere. The inquiry emphasized that such cognitive bias can affect even experienced investigators and therefore requires organizational safeguards rather than reliance on individual judgment alone. As a result, major case management procedures evolved significantly. Modern homicide investigations increasingly rely on structured decision-making processes. Investigative teams document why specific decisions are made, maintain detailed records of alternative hypotheses, and encourage independent review of significant investigative conclusions. Supervisors regularly examine whether detectives remain objectively evaluating all available evidence instead of focusing prematurely on a single suspect. These procedural changes have become standard practice in many Canadian police services. Another important area transformed by the Jessup investigation involves forensic science. During the 1980s, forensic laboratories relied upon techniques that represented the best available science of the period. Hair comparison, fiber examination, blood typing, and other methods played important investigative roles. Yet many of these disciplines possessed limitations that became more apparent as scientific research advanced. The emergence of DNA profiling fundamentally changed forensic investigations. Unlike many earlier comparison methods, DNA analysis provides an exceptionally high degree of individual identification when properly conducted. It also permits investigators to exclude innocent individuals with equal confidence. In the Jessup investigation, DNA accomplished both objectives. It demonstrated conclusively that Guy Paul Moran was not the source of critical biological evidence while eventually identifying Calvin Hoover decades later. This dual capability distinguishes DNA from many traditional forensic techniques. Rather than simply supporting investigative theories, DNA frequently has the power to eliminate incorrect assumptions entirely. For investigators, this reinforces the importance of allowing objective scientific evidence to shape investigative conclusions rather than expecting laboratory findings to confirm pre-existing beliefs. The preservation of evidence also became a major lesson arising from the case. When investigators processed Christine's murder scene in late 1984, they could not have anticipated the extraordinary capabilities that forensic laboratories would possess decades later. Nevertheless, they carefully collected and preserved biological material according to professional standards available at the time. That decision ultimately made the 2020 identification possible. Today, police agencies routinely preserve biological evidence from serious violent crimes for extended periods, recognizing that future scientific advances may reveal information unavailable during the original investigation. Cold case units regularly re-examine stored evidence whenever new laboratory methods emerge. The Jessup investigation is frequently cited when discussing why long-term evidence preservation remains essential. Another lasting consequence concerns the relationship between law enforcement and forensic laboratories. Historically, some investigations relied heavily upon verbal communication between detectives and scientists. Modern practice emphasizes detailed documentation, standardized reporting, quality assurance procedures, peer review, and accreditation requirements. Laboratories maintain rigorous protocols governing sample handling, contamination prevention, analytical validation, and reporting standards. These developments strengthen both scientific reliability and public confidence. Public confidence became especially important following Guy Paul Moran's wrongful conviction. Wrongful convictions affect more than the innocent individual imprisoned for a crime they did not commit. They also leave the actual offender unidentified, delay justice for victims' families, consume significant public resources, and undermine confidence in legal institutions. Every wrongful conviction, therefore, represents both a personal tragedy and a systemic failure. The Jessup case illustrates this principle clearly. While Moran spent years navigating criminal proceedings and imprisonment, the person actually responsible for Christine's murder remained unidentified. Investigative attention concentrated primarily on the wrong individual, reducing opportunities to identify the true offender through traditional investigative methods available during the late 1980s and early 1990s. Although investigators acted according to the information and scientific understanding available at the time, later developments demonstrated how important continual reassessment remains. This philosophy now influences cold case investigations throughout Canada. Rather than viewing unsolved cases as static historical records, investigators increasingly recognize them as dynamic investigations capable of benefiting from new technologies, improved analytical methods, and fresh perspectives. Dedicated cold case units systematically review historical homicide files to determine whether advances in DNA analysis, fingerprint technology, digital imaging, or investigative genealogy might produce new leads. Christine Jessup's case is often referenced during discussions of these review programs because it illustrates the value of persistence over decades. The investigation also highlights the importance of interdisciplinary cooperation. No single scientific breakthrough solved the case independently. Instead, success required collaboration among homicide investigators, forensic biologists, genealogists, laboratory scientists, legal advisors, historians, archivists, and prosecutors. Each discipline contributed specialized expertise while maintaining rigorous professional standards. Investigative genetic genealogy itself represents a particularly interdisciplinary process. After forensic scientists produce a usable DNA profile, genealogists examine family relationships using historical records. Detectives then evaluate potential suspects through conventional investigative methods. Laboratory scientists subsequently confirm any proposed identification through direct DNA comparison whenever possible. Legal experts review investigative procedures to ensure compliance with applicable laws governing privacy and evidence. The Jessup investigation followed this collaborative model. Its success, therefore, reflects not only scientific innovation, but also effective coordination among multiple professional disciplines. Educational institutions have also recognized the case's importance. Canadian law schools frequently examine the investigation when teaching criminal procedure, evidence, prosecutorial ethics, and wrongful convictions. Police academies discuss tunnel vision, investigative objectivity, and major case management using the Jessup investigation as a practical example. Forensic science programs analyze the evolution of DNA technology demonstrated by the case. As a result, generations of students entering legal and investigative professions continue learning from the successes and failures associated with the investigation. Internationally, the case has attracted attention because it demonstrates several significant developments occurring simultaneously. It illustrates how DNA can overturn wrongful convictions. It demonstrates the practical value of investigative genetic genealogy. It emphasizes the necessity of preserving historical forensic evidence. It highlights organizational reforms addressing investigative bias. And it reinforces the principle that scientific progress can continue transforming criminal investigations long after the original crime occurred. Not every cold case can be solved through DNA. Some investigations lack preserved biological evidence. Others involve evidence too degraded for modern analysis. Some offenders remain unidentified despite extensive forensic testing because no usable biological material exists. Christine Jessup's investigation, therefore, should not be viewed as suggesting that every historical homicide will eventually be solved. Instead, it demonstrates what becomes possible when several critical factors align: careful evidence preservation, advances in laboratory science, rigorous investigative methodology, and sustained institutional commitment over many years. The identification of Calvin Hoover also prompted reflection regarding the limitations of delayed justice. Because Hoover died in 2015, 5 years before investigators publicly identified him, the criminal justice system could not conduct a trial or impose legal accountability through traditional judicial processes. No jury would hear evidence, no defense would be presented, no verdict would be delivered in court. Investigators acknowledged this reality openly. Their objective was not to create certainty through public announcement alone, but to present scientifically supported findings explaining why they had concluded Hoover was responsible. This distinction reflects an important principle of responsible criminal investigation. Evidence may establish historical truth even when criminal prosecution is no longer possible. For Christine Jessup's family, identifying the offender answered a question that had remained unresolved for 36 years. For Guy Paul Morin, the identification provided additional independent confirmation of his innocence. For investigators, it represented the culmination of decades of disciplined work. For Canadian society, it reinforced confidence that careful science and objective investigation can eventually correct even the most difficult historical errors. The murder of Christine Jessup remains one of Canada's most significant criminal cases, not simply because it lasted for more than 3 decades, but because every stage of the investigation, from the original disappearance, through the wrongful conviction, to the eventual DNA identification, reshaped how future investigations would be conducted. Its legacy continues to influence policing, forensic science, legal education, and public policy, ensuring that the lessons learned from one family's tragedy continue strengthening the pursuit of justice for generations to come. As the investigation into Christine Jessup's murder became part of Canadian legal and forensic history, its influence extended well beyond the boundaries of a single criminal case. Researchers, criminologists, forensic scientists, legal scholars, and police organizations increasingly examine the investigation not only to understand what happened in 1984, but also to identify broader lessons about how criminal investigations evolve over time. The case demonstrated that justice is not a fixed process. It develops alongside science, technology, professional standards, and society's willingness to acknowledge past mistakes. One of the most remarkable aspects of the investigation is the way in which evidence collected in a rural Ontario community during the mid-1980s retained its value across multiple generations of forensic science. When investigators first examined the evidence recovered during the homicide investigation, DNA profiling had not yet entered routine criminal investigations. Laboratories instead relied upon techniques that represented the highest scientific standards of that era. Biological samples were collected because experienced investigators understood they might eventually become important, even if contemporary laboratories could not yet extract all the information they contained. That foresight proved decisive. Throughout the late 1980s and early 1990s, improvements in DNA technology allowed scientists to generate increasingly reliable genetic profiles from preserved biological material. Those advances first demonstrated that Guy Paul Morin could not be the source of the crime scene DNA. Years later, further technological developments expanded the possibilities once again. Instead of merely comparing DNA against criminal databases, investigators could now explore genetic relationships through carefully regulated genealogical research. The progression illustrates a recurring theme in forensic science. Every generation inherits evidence collected by those who came before. Scientific limitations existing today may disappear tomorrow. For this reason, evidence preservation has become one of the most fundamental responsibilities in homicide investigations worldwide. Christine Jessup's investigation is often referenced when police agencies discuss long-term evidence management. Modern forensic storage facilities maintain strict environmental controls to preserve biological evidence, digital media, physical exhibits, clothing, weapons, fingerprints, photographs, and investigative documentation. Every item is cataloged carefully because investigators cannot predict which future scientific development may transform previously inconclusive material into critical evidence. The case also reinforced the importance of documentation. Cold case investigations frequently involve detectives who were not present during the original inquiry. In Christine's case, More than 3 decades separated the initial investigation from the identification of Calvin Hoover. Many original investigators had retired before the final breakthrough occurred. Success depended upon the quality of investigative notes, interview records, laboratory reports, maps, photographs, and evidence logs prepared years earlier. Without comprehensive documentation, later investigators would have struggled to reconstruct events accurately. Detailed record-keeping allowed modern detectives to understand not only what evidence existed, but also how it had been collected, preserved, analyzed, and interpreted throughout the investigation's history. The Ontario Provincial Police have repeatedly emphasized that cold case investigations represent cumulative efforts rather than isolated breakthroughs. Every investigator contributes information that may later become significant. A witness interview considered inconclusive in 1 decade may acquire new importance after scientific evidence identifies a previously unknown suspect. Likewise, evidence preserved without immediate investigative value may become decisive once laboratory capabilities improve. The Christine Jessup investigation exemplifies this cumulative process. Equally significant was the role of public cooperation. During the original investigation, hundreds of volunteers participated in search efforts. Community members reported possible sightings, unfamiliar vehicles, and observations that they believed might assist investigators. Although many tips ultimately proved unrelated, public participation remained essential. Serious criminal investigations frequently rely upon cooperation between law enforcement and the communities they serve. Public involvement continued long after the initial search concluded. Media organizations periodically revisited the investigation through newspaper articles, television documentaries, and anniversary reports. These public discussions maintained awareness of the case while encouraging individuals with potentially relevant information to contact investigators. Although the eventual identification resulted primarily from forensic science rather than eyewitness testimony, continued public attention ensured that the investigation remained active rather than fading into obscurity. Media coverage itself evolved considerably over the 36-year investigation. Reporting during the 1980s focused largely upon the disappearance, search efforts, homicide investigation, and subsequent prosecution of Guy Paul Morin. Following Morin's exoneration, journalistic attention shifted toward wrongful convictions, forensic reliability, and criminal justice reform. By 2020, coverage emphasized investigative genetic genealogy and scientific innovation. This evolution reflected changing public understanding of criminal investigations. Advances in DNA technology, improvements in forensic science education, and greater awareness of wrongful convictions all influenced how journalists explained complex investigations to audiences. The Christine Jessup case therefore became not only a criminal investigation, but also an educational example illustrating the changing relationship between science and justice. Legal scholars likewise continue studying the investigation because it highlights the importance of post-conviction review. Historically, criminal convictions often carried an assumption of finality. However, developments in forensic science demonstrated that new evidence can emerge years after legal proceedings conclude. Modern justice systems increasingly recognize the necessity of mechanisms allowing convictions to be reconsidered when credible scientific evidence becomes available. Guy Paul Morin's exoneration remains among Canada's most significant examples of this principle. The case demonstrates that correcting wrongful convictions serves multiple purposes. It protects innocent individuals. It restores public confidence. It improves investigative practices. Most importantly, it redirects investigative attention toward identifying the actual offender. The eventual identification of Calvin Hoover illustrates the final step in that process. From a criminological perspective, the case also raises questions concerning offender identification and investigative opportunity. Hoover had not become a primary suspect during the original investigation. Publicly available information suggests he attracted little investigative attention compared with Guy Paul Morin. This circumstance illustrates a practical reality confronting homicide investigators. Serious investigations often involve thousands of individuals who lived, worked, traveled, or maintained some connection to the relevant geographic area. Without strong physical evidence linking a particular individual to the crime, distinguishing one potential suspect from hundreds of others can be extraordinarily difficult. Modern DNA technology fundamentally alters that equation. Rather than beginning with a suspect and seeking supporting evidence, investigators can begin with biological evidence and work systematically toward identifying its source. This reversal represents one of the most important conceptual changes introduced by forensic genetics. Instead of asking, "Can we prove this suspect committed the crime?" investigators increasingly ask, "Whose DNA is this?" Only after answering that scientific question do traditional investigative methods evaluate opportunity, historical context, and corroborating evidence. The Jessup investigation demonstrates the effectiveness of this evidence-first approach. It also illustrates the importance of interdisciplinary expertise. Forensic scientists generated reliable DNA profiles. Genealogists constructed extensive family trees. Historians located archival records. Investigators analyzed historical movements and circumstances. Laboratory specialists confirmed direct DNA comparisons. Legal advisors ensured procedural compliance. No single discipline solved the case independently. Success resulted from careful collaboration among specialists working toward a common objective while respecting the standards governing their respective professions. This collaborative model has become increasingly common in modern cold case investigations. Many police agencies now maintain multidisciplinary teams combining investigative experience with specialized scientific expertise. Rather than treating forensic laboratories as separate institutions performing isolated analyses, investigators integrate scientific consultation throughout investigative planning. Christine Jessup's case demonstrated the value of this integrated approach. The investigation also reminds observers that forensic science continues evolving. Methods considered revolutionary today may eventually be replaced by even more sophisticated technologies. Future investigators may possess analytical capabilities currently unimaginable, just as detectives in 1984 could not have anticipated investigative genetic genealogy. Recognizing this reality encourages continued investment in scientific research, evidence preservation, professional education, and institutional learning. Each solved cold case contributes knowledge extending beyond the immediate investigation. The Jessup investigation influenced police training, prosecutorial practice, forensic standards, judicial oversight, evidence management, and public understanding of criminal investigations. Its significance, therefore, cannot be measured solely by identifying Calvin Hoover. The investigation changed how future cases would be approached. It strengthened safeguards protecting innocent suspects. It encouraged greater scientific rigor. It reinforced the necessity of continual reassessment. And it demonstrated that truth sometimes emerges not through dramatic discoveries, but through decades of patient, methodical work supported by advances in science. For those studying criminal investigations today, the murder of Christine Jessup represents far more than a historical case file. It stands as a comprehensive example of how investigative persistence, institutional accountability, forensic innovation, and a commitment to objective evidence can ultimately reshape both an individual investigation and an entire justice system. The lessons continue to influence investigators across Canada and internationally, reminding every new generation entering law enforcement that solving crimes requires not only determination, but also humility, the willingness to question assumptions, embrace new evidence, and allow science to illuminate truths that once seemed permanently hidden. By the time Calvin Hoover was identified in 2020, the investigation into Christine Jessup's murder had become one of the clearest examples of how the relationship between science and criminal investigation has changed over the past half-century. Detectives who began their careers in the early 1980s worked in an environment without mobile phones, internet databases, digital surveillance systems, GPS tracking, or modern DNA analysis. Investigators relied heavily on witness interviews, handwritten reports, physical searches, forensic techniques available at the time, and countless hours of manual record review. Every lead required investigators to travel, make telephone calls, examine paper files, and compare information without the benefit of computerized investigative systems that are now considered routine. When Christine disappeared on October 3, SIL 1984, Officers responded according to the standards of that era. Missing child investigations already demanded urgency, but the systems supporting those investigations were very different from those available today. There were no nationwide Amber Alerts. There were no social media platforms capable of instantly distributing a child's photograph to millions of people. Surveillance cameras were uncommon in rural communities, and private security cameras on homes did not exist. The opportunity to reconstruct a victim's final movements depended almost entirely on eyewitness recollections. Those limitations shaped every aspect of the original investigation. Detectives canvassed neighborhoods by going door to door. Search coordinators organized volunteers using printed maps. Witness statements were typed, filed, and physically stored in investigative binders. Telephone records required formal requests and often significant waiting periods. Every investigative step demanded time. Modern investigators examining the Jessup case often note that if the crime had occurred decades later, the investigation would likely have unfolded differently. Digital evidence might have documented vehicle movements. Security cameras might have captured images along Christine's route. Cellular telephone records could have assisted investigators in reconstructing timelines. Automatic license plate recognition systems, electronic banking records, or location data might have generated investigative leads unavailable in 1984. Yet these observations should not be mistaken for criticism of the original investigators. Police officers can investigate only with the tools available during their own time. The investigators assigned to Christine's disappearance devoted enormous effort to locating her, interviewing witnesses, collecting evidence, and pursuing leads under the technological limitations that existed in the mid-1980s. The eventual identification of Calvin Hoover therefore reflects not a failure of effort, but the extraordinary pace of scientific and technological development. One of the most important advances has been the digitization of investigative records. Historical homicide investigations often involve thousands of pages of documentation accumulated over many years. Converting those records into searchable digital formats allows investigators to locate names, addresses, dates, vehicles, and investigative actions much more efficiently than manual paper review. Large investigative databases also permit detectives to compare historical information across multiple cases. Although no evidence has suggested that Calvin Hoover was responsible for additional known homicides, modern investigative systems routinely examine whether offenders identified in one case may have connections to unsolved crimes in other jurisdictions. Such cross-jurisdictional analysis has become increasingly valuable as computerized record systems improve information sharing among police agencies. The Jessup investigation also illustrates how improvements in forensic laboratory procedures have enhanced reliability. Contemporary DNA laboratories operate under extensive accreditation standards governing every stage of analysis. Evidence handling, contamination prevention, instrument calibration, quality assurance, peer review, and reporting procedures are carefully documented. These safeguards help ensure that forensic conclusions are scientifically valid and reproducible. Such procedures evolved significantly during the decades separating Christine's murder from the identification of Hoover. The wrongful conviction of Guy Paul Morin contributed to broader discussions regarding forensic reliability, expert testimony, and the responsibilities of scientific witnesses. Modern forensic practice places substantial emphasis on communicating both the strengths and limitations of scientific findings clearly and accurately. This balanced approach reflects an important lesson learned through cases like Christine Jessup's. Science is a powerful investigative tool, but it must be presented objectively. Investigators, prosecutors, defense counsel, judges, and juries all rely upon accurate scientific interpretation when making critical decisions. Another notable development involves cooperation between police agencies and academic researchers. Universities increasingly collaborate with law enforcement organizations to improve forensic methods, statistical analysis, investigative psychology, and evidence interpretation. Research generated through these partnerships contributes directly to improvements in criminal investigations. Christine Jessup's case has frequently been discussed in academic literature examining wrongful convictions, investigative decision-making, DNA technology, and criminal justice reform. The investigation, therefore, continues educating professionals long after its official conclusion. Cold case investigators also emphasize that solving historical homicides requires exceptional patience. Unlike active investigations, where new information may arrive daily, cold cases often progress slowly. Months or even years may pass without significant developments. Detectives revisit witness statements, review archived evidence, examine historical records, and wait for scientific capabilities to advance. Success frequently depends upon persistence rather than speed. The Jessup investigation demonstrates this principle clearly. Between Christine's disappearance in 1984 and Hoover's identification in 2020, investigators experienced multiple phases of activity. There was the initial search, the homicide investigation, criminal prosecution, wrongful conviction, DNA exoneration, public inquiry, forensic reevaluation, genealogical research, and finally, DNA confirmation. Each phase built upon work completed during earlier stages. No single breakthrough solved the case independently. Instead, decades of incremental progress eventually produced sufficient evidence to identify the offender. The investigation also highlights the significance of institutional memory. Police organizations must preserve not only evidence but also investigative knowledge. Experienced detectives retire. Supervisors change assignments. Prosecutors conclude their careers. Without careful documentation, valuable information can disappear as personnel change. Major case management systems now emphasize continuity precisely because investigations sometimes extend across multiple generations of investigators. Christine Jessup's homicide remained active long enough for several generations of detectives to contribute to its resolution. This continuity depended upon disciplined documentation practices established long before modern digital technologies became available. The public announcement identifying Hoover also prompted renewed discussion regarding the meaning of justice. Because Hoover died before investigators identified him, no criminal trial occurred. Some observers questioned whether identifying a deceased offender could truly constitute justice. Others argued that establishing the truth remained profoundly important regardless of whether prosecution was possible. Legal scholars often distinguish between different dimensions of justice. Criminal accountability involves formal judicial proceedings. Historical truth concerns accurately determining what occurred. Institutional accountability examines how investigations are conducted. For victims' families, personal answers may represent another equally significant dimension. The Jessup investigation touched each of these areas. Although criminal prosecution was no longer possible, historical truth became clearer through DNA evidence. Institutional accountability had already been addressed in part through the Kaufman inquiry. The identification of Hoover also provided Christine's family with information unavailable during the preceding 36 years. For many investigators, these outcomes retain substantial value even in the absence of a courtroom verdict. The investigation likewise reinforced public appreciation for scientific investment. Advances in DNA analysis did not emerge suddenly. They resulted from decades of research conducted by molecular biologists, geneticists, forensic scientists, statisticians, laboratory technicians, and countless other specialists working across universities, government laboratories, and private institutions around the world. Every improvement in DNA extraction, sequencing, amplification, contamination control, and computational analysis expanded the investigative possibilities available to law enforcement. The identification of Hoover therefore reflects not only police persistence, but also decades of international scientific progress. Today, cold case investigators continue applying these evolving techniques to unresolved homicides throughout Canada and internationally. Each successful identification provides valuable experience that may assist future investigations. At the same time, investigators recognize that every case presents unique challenges. Some historical investigations contain little or no preserved biological evidence. Others involve degraded samples unsuitable for advanced analysis. Some cases lack sufficient documentation to reconstruct events reliably. Consequently, while Christine Jessup's investigation demonstrates the remarkable potential of modern forensic science, it also illustrates the importance of preserving evidence, maintaining detailed investigative records, and continually reevaluating historical cases as technology evolves. More broadly, the case stands as a reminder that criminal investigations are not static events frozen in time. They are living processes capable of changing as new evidence emerges, scientific understanding advances, and institutions learn from past experience. The murder of Christine Jessup transformed Canadian criminal justice in ways few investigations ever do. It improved investigative procedures. It strengthened forensic standards. It influenced legal education. It encouraged scientific innovation. And ultimately, after 36 years, it demonstrated that evidence carefully preserved by one generation can allow another generation to uncover the truth that had remained hidden for decades. The identification of Calvin Hoover through investigative genetic genealogy marked a significant milestone not only for the Christine Jessup investigation, but also for the future of cold case investigations across Canada. By demonstrating that decades-old biological evidence could be combined with modern genealogical research to identify an offender who had never appeared in traditional criminal DNA databases, the case expanded the range of investigative options available to law enforcement. It also prompted careful discussion about how emerging technologies should be used responsibly, particularly when they involve sensitive genetic information. Investigative genetic genealogy differs from conventional DNA profiling in both its purpose and methodology. Traditional forensic DNA analysis compares biological evidence recovered from a crime scene with DNA profiles contained in authorized criminal databases. If an exact match exists, investigators may identify a suspect directly. However, when no such match is available, as was the situation in Christine Jessup's case for many years, the investigation can reach an impasse despite the existence of a complete DNA profile. Genealogical analysis approaches the problem differently. Rather than seeking an exact match to the unknown individual, specialists identify biological relatives whose genetic information has been voluntarily made available under the policies of genealogy databases and applicable legal frameworks. Even distant relatives can provide valuable clues. By constructing extensive family trees and tracing generations of descendants, genealogists gradually narrow the range of possible individuals who could have contributed the unknown DNA. The process requires far more than scientific laboratory work. Genealogists examine birth registrations, marriage records, census documents, obituary notices, military records, immigration files, cemetery records, newspaper archives, property records, and numerous other historical sources. Every relationship must be verified carefully because a single incorrect assumption can lead researchers away from the correct family line. Once potential individuals are identified, traditional police investigation resumes. Detectives determine whether those individuals were alive at the relevant time, lived in appropriate geographic areas, possess realistic opportunities to commit the offense, and can be connected through independently verifiable evidence. If investigators identify a promising candidate, direct DNA comparison remains essential before any conclusion is reached. The Christine Jessup investigation followed precisely this sequence. The genealogical research generated investigative leads, but it was the subsequent forensic comparison between Calvin Hoover's biological sample and the preserved crime scene DNA that confirmed the identification. This distinction is important because genealogy itself does not establish criminal responsibility. Instead, it directs investigators toward individuals who require further examination through established forensic and investigative procedures. Following the public announcement in 2020, police agencies throughout Canada and internationally examined the investigation with considerable interest. Cold case units recognized that many unsolved homicides share characteristics similar to the Jessup investigation. Biological evidence had been preserved. DNA profiles existed. Traditional database searches had produced no matches. These cases suddenly appeared more promising because genealogy offered an entirely new investigative pathway. Nevertheless, investigators also acknowledged important practical limitations. Investigative genetic genealogy cannot assist every homicide investigation. Some cases lack recoverable biological evidence. Others involve DNA too degraded for meaningful analysis. Certain investigations contain mixtures of DNA from multiple individuals that remain difficult to interpret. Additionally, genealogical databases vary in size, participation rates, privacy policies, and legal accessibility depending upon jurisdiction. Success, therefore, depends upon multiple factors aligning simultaneously. The Jessup investigation happened to possess several favorable characteristics. Investigators had preserved high-quality biological evidence from 1984. Modern laboratory methods produced a reliable DNA profile. Genealogical research identified informative biological relatives. Historical records permitted accurate family reconstruction. And investigators ultimately obtained a biological sample suitable for direct comparison with Calvin Hoover. Each stage depended upon the successful completion of the previous one. Beyond its scientific significance, the investigation also influenced discussions regarding ethical oversight. Genetic information contains highly personal data extending beyond the individual who submits a DNA sample. Because biological relatives share portions of their genetic material, genealogical research may reveal family relationships unknown to participants themselves. For this reason, governments, privacy experts, legal scholars, and law enforcement agencies continue examining appropriate safeguards governing investigative genetic genealogy. Canadian authorities have emphasized that the technique should be applied carefully, transparently, and primarily in investigations involving serious violent crime where conventional methods have proven unsuccessful. These safeguards seek to balance two important public interests. One is the effective investigation of serious criminal offenses. The other is the protection of individual privacy. The Christine Jessup investigation frequently serves as a practical example during these discussions because it demonstrates both the remarkable investigative potential of genealogy and the importance of responsible oversight. Another significant aspect of the case concerns public trust. Wrongful convictions can undermine confidence in criminal justice institutions. Scientific breakthroughs capable of correcting historical errors may help restore that confidence, but only if investigations remain transparent, objective, and evidence-based. Throughout the 2020 announcement, the Ontario Provincial Police carefully explained the investigative process leading to Hoover's identification. Officials described how genealogical research generated leads. They explained how forensic laboratories confirmed the DNA match. They acknowledged the inability to prosecute Hoover because of his death, and they recognized the profound consequences experienced by Christine Jessup's family and by Guy Paul Moran. This transparent communication reflected lessons learned over decades of criminal justice reform. Investigators increasingly recognize that maintaining public confidence requires openness regarding investigative methods, scientific limitations, and evidentiary standards. The Jessup investigation also demonstrates the value of interdisciplinary education. Police officers investigating modern cold cases benefit from understanding genetics, genealogy, digital evidence, psychology, and legal procedure in addition to traditional investigative techniques. Similarly, forensic scientists increasingly appreciate the practical realities confronting detectives. Genealogists learn how family reconstruction supports criminal investigation. Lawyers examine how emerging scientific evidence should be presented in court. The result is greater collaboration across professional disciplines. Educational institutions have responded accordingly. Police academies now incorporate discussions of DNA technology, investigative bias, wrongful convictions, and cold case methodology into investigative training. Universities offer specialized programs combining forensic science with criminal justice. Professional conferences regularly examine cases like Christine Jessup's to illustrate how scientific innovation influences investigative practice. The investigation, therefore, continues contributing to professional education years after its formal conclusion. For victims' families, however, these broader institutional developments remain secondary. The central reality is profoundly personal. A child disappeared. A family endured decades without answers. An innocent man was wrongly convicted. The actual offender lived for many years without being identified. Only after remarkable scientific advances did investigators establish who was responsible. No technological achievement can erase those facts. What science accomplished was the replacement of uncertainty with evidence. That distinction matters. For decades, investigators could say only that unknown DNA existed. After 2020, they could identify the individual from whom that DNA originated. Historical speculation gave way to scientifically supported findings. This transition illustrates one of forensic science's greatest strengths. Rather than relying upon memory, assumption, or public opinion, scientific investigation seeks conclusions grounded in objective evidence that can be tested, reviewed, and independently verified. The Christine Jessup investigation also reminds us that solving a cold case rarely results from a single dramatic moment. Public announcements often focus on the final identification, but behind that announcement lie thousands of hours of investigative work spanning multiple generations. Evidence must be preserved. Laboratories must refine analytical methods. Genealogists must reconstruct family histories. Detectives must verify historical records. Legal advisors must ensure procedural compliance. Each contribution forms part of a much larger investigative process. When viewed in its entirety, the investigation represents decades of patient, methodical effort rather than sudden discovery. That reality reflects the nature of modern cold case investigation itself. Progress often occurs gradually. Breakthroughs emerge from cumulative scientific advancement. Success depends upon institutional persistence as much as technological innovation. The murder of Christine Jessup remains one of Canada's most important examples of these principles in practice, demonstrating that while justice delayed cannot undo tragedy, careful evidence preservation, objective investigation, and scientific progress can eventually illuminate truths that once appeared permanently beyond reach. The resolution of the Christine Jessup investigation also invites a broader examination of how cold case investigations are conducted in the 21st century. Around the world, law enforcement agencies now manage thousands of unsolved homicides, many of which date back decades. While every investigation presents unique circumstances, the Jessup case demonstrates several principles that increasingly guide modern cold case work. Preserve evidence carefully, reassess historical assumptions, embrace scientific innovation responsibly, and recognize that an investigation does not necessarily end simply because time has passed. Cold case units occupy a distinctive place within modern policing. Unlike investigators responding to newly committed crimes, cold case detectives work with events that occurred years or even decades earlier. Witnesses may no longer remember important details. Some individuals have relocated, while others have died. Buildings may have been demolished, businesses closed, roads altered, and entire neighborhoods transformed. Physical evidence, if not preserved correctly, may have deteriorated beyond recovery. Every investigative decision must account for the effects of time. Yet time can also become an investigative advantage. Advances in science frequently create opportunities that did not exist during the original investigation. DNA technology represents the most widely recognized example, but it is not the only one. Improvements in fingerprint enhancement, digital image processing, isotope analysis, forensic anthropology, forensic genealogy, geospatial mapping, and computerized record management have all contributed to solving historical investigations once considered impossible to resolve. The Christine Jessup investigation illustrates this dynamic particularly well. When detectives first searched for Christine in October 1984, they could not rely upon the technologies that define contemporary investigations. There were no digital case management systems capable of instantly cross-referencing names, addresses, and investigative reports. Mapping search areas required printed maps and handwritten notes. Witness interviews were recorded manually and organized in paper files. Laboratory capabilities reflected the scientific standards of the time. Despite these limitations, investigators collected and preserved evidence with remarkable care. That decision became the foundation upon which every later scientific advancement depended. Modern investigators frequently emphasize that evidence preservation is among the most important investments a police agency can make in unresolved homicide investigations. Even when current laboratory techniques cannot fully analyze a particular sample, preserving that material ensures future investigators may benefit from scientific methods that have not yet been developed. This philosophy reflects an important shift in investigative thinking. Rather than viewing forensic analysis as a single event occurring immediately after a crime, investigators increasingly understand it as an ongoing process. Evidence can be re-examined repeatedly as laboratory methods improve. Each generation of forensic scientists may obtain information unavailable to those who preceded them. The Jessup investigation underwent exactly this progression. Evidence collected in 1984 supported forensic testing in the 1990s, leading to Guy Paul Moran's exoneration. Years later, that same evidence supported investigative genetic genealogy, ultimately identifying Calvin Hoover. The biological material itself had not changed. What changed was science's ability to interpret it. This observation carries important implications for future investigations. Police agencies today routinely preserve evidence from serious violent crimes with the expectation that technological advances will continue expanding forensic capabilities. Laboratory procedures are designed not only to answer present questions, but also to protect future opportunities for analysis. Another significant lesson concerns investigative flexibility. The Kaufman inquiry demonstrated how investigative tunnel vision can influence decision-making when investigators become committed to a single theory prematurely. Modern investigative training therefore emphasizes continual reassessment. Cold case detectives routinely ask questions such as, if this investigation began today, would we approach it differently? What assumptions guided the original investigation? Which conclusions were supported by objective evidence? What new technologies or analytical methods are now available? Could historical records reveal information previously overlooked? These questions encourage investigators to treat historical cases as living investigations rather than fixed historical narratives. The Christine Jessup investigation provides a practical example of this approach. Once DNA excluded Guy Paul Moran, investigators did not simply reopen the original investigation in its previous form. Instead, they reconsidered the evidence without assuming earlier conclusions remained correct. Investigative genetic genealogy represented one component of this broader reassessment. The case also highlights the importance of multidisciplinary collaboration. Cold case investigations increasingly involve experts from numerous professional fields. Detectives coordinate investigative strategy. Forensic biologists analyze DNA. Genealogists reconstruct family relationships. Digital specialists organize historical records. Prosecutors advise on evidentiary issues. Historians and archivists locate public documents. Laboratory quality assurance specialists verify scientific reliability. Each discipline contributes unique expertise. The successful identification of Calvin Hoover depended upon collaboration rather than isolated effort. Modern policing increasingly recognizes that solving complex investigations often requires integrating specialized knowledge from multiple professions. International cooperation has likewise become increasingly important. Scientific discoveries developed in one country frequently benefit investigations elsewhere. DNA technologies pioneered through international research become available to forensic laboratories worldwide. Investigative methodologies are shared through professional organizations, academic conferences, scientific publications, and law enforcement partnerships. The principles underlying investigative genetic genealogy, for example, developed through research and practical application involving numerous scientific institutions and police agencies. Canadian investigators adapted those developments within Canadian legal and ethical frameworks to assist investigations such as Christine Jessup's. This exchange of knowledge continues strengthening homicide investigations globally. At the same time, investigators remain mindful that every technological innovation must operate within appropriate legal boundaries. Privacy protections, judicial oversight, evidence rules, and ethical standards remain essential components of responsible criminal investigation. Public confidence depends not only upon solving crimes, but also upon ensuring investigative methods respect individual rights and maintain scientific integrity. The Jessup investigation frequently appears in discussions balancing these considerations. It demonstrates the extraordinary value of investigative genetic genealogy while also reinforcing the importance of transparency, legal oversight, and careful procedural safeguards. Another enduring lesson involves communication with victims' families. Cold case investigations often continue for decades. During that time, families experience repeated cycles of hope and disappointment as new leads emerge and investigations evolve. Maintaining respectful communication becomes an important responsibility for investigators. Family liaison officers and homicide investigators increasingly recognize that relatives deserve accurate information regarding investigative progress, scientific developments, and realistic expectations. The identification of Calvin Hoover did not eliminate decades of grief experienced by Christine Jessup's family. However, it replaced uncertainty with evidence. For many families affected by unresolved homicide, understanding what happened can hold profound significance even when prosecution is no longer possible. The case further illustrates the importance of institutional persistence. Maintaining an open homicide investigation for decades requires sustained organizational commitment. Evidence must be stored securely. Records must remain accessible. Investigative knowledge must transfer between successive generations of detectives. Funding must support periodic forensic review. Without this long-term commitment, many cold cases would gradually disappear into archival storage with little realistic possibility of future resolution. The Ontario Provincial Police demonstrated the opposite approach. By preserving evidence, maintaining investigative records, and periodically re-evaluating forensic opportunities, investigators ensured that scientific advances could eventually be applied effectively. The identification of Hoover therefore reflects institutional perseverance as much as technological innovation. Today, police agencies across Canada continue reviewing historical homicide investigations using similar principles. Each unsolved case presents different opportunities and different limitations. Some may benefit from DNA reanalysis, others from digital reconstruction of historical records, still others from renewed witness interviews or improvements in forensic anthropology. No universal solution exists. Instead, investigators evaluate each case individually while remaining open to emerging scientific developments. Christine Jessup's investigation remains one of the clearest demonstrations that the pursuit of truth need not end simply because decades have passed. Its legacy extends beyond the identification of one offender. It strengthened evidence preservation practices. It encouraged objective investigative review. It advanced forensic science education. It influenced legal reform following a wrongful conviction. And it demonstrated that careful scientific work, supported by disciplined investigative practice, can eventually resolve questions that once appeared destined to remain unanswered. For future investigators entering the field of homicide investigation, the case offers a lasting reminder that every carefully documented interview, every properly preserved evidence package, every accurately maintained laboratory record, and every willingness to question previous assumptions may one day contribute to discovering the truth. The investigation into Christine Jessup's murder stands as evidence that while time can complicate justice, it does not necessarily prevent it, provided that science, professionalism, and persistence continue working together in pursuit of the facts. More than 3 decades separated the afternoon Christine Jessup disappeared from the day investigators publicly identified the man responsible for her murder. During those 36 years, Canada changed dramatically. Communities expanded, technology transformed daily life, forensic science advanced beyond what investigators in 1984 could have imagined, and an entirely new generation grew up, knowing Christine's name only through newspaper archives, television documentaries, legal studies, and discussions about one of the country's most significant wrongful convictions. Yet despite those changes, one element remained remarkably constant: the evidence. Evidence does not experience the passage of time in the same way people do. Witnesses forget details, investigators retire, families relocate. Public attention shifts toward newer cases, but properly preserved forensic evidence remains silent, waiting for science to ask better questions. That simple principle lies at the heart of the Christine Jessup investigation. When forensic specialists first collected biological material in late 1984, they could not fully analyze it using the technology available at the time. Nevertheless, trained investigators understood an essential responsibility of homicide investigation: preserve everything that may one day matter. That decision reflected professional discipline rather than certainty. No one could predict how forensic genetics would develop over the following decades. The eventual identification of Calvin Hoover demonstrates why that discipline remains so important. From an investigative perspective, one of the most remarkable features of the case is that the biological evidence consistently pointed toward the same unknown individual. What changed over time was not the evidence itself, but humanity's ability to interpret it. During the 1980s, investigators knew the biological material existed but lacked modern DNA profiling. By the mid-1990s, DNA analysis excluded Guy Paul Moran and demonstrated that investigators had convicted the wrong person. By 2020, investigative genetic genealogy transformed that same anonymous DNA profile into the identity of Calvin Hoover. 3 different eras of forensic science examined the same evidence. Each generation extracted more information than the one before. This progression illustrates an important concept within forensic investigation. Scientific conclusions are always limited by contemporary knowledge and available technology. Responsible investigators recognize those limitations and avoid assuming that current methods represent the final stage of scientific development. The Christine Jessup investigation, therefore, encourages humility alongside confidence. Confidence in carefully collected evidence. Humility regarding what present-day science may not yet be capable of revealing. Another important aspect of the investigation concerns institutional learning. Police organizations improve not only through successful investigations, but also through critical examination of mistakes. The wrongful conviction of Guy Paul Moran remains among the most carefully studied criminal justice failures in Canadian history. The significance of that examination lies not in assigning blame to individuals decades later, but in identifying organizational improvements capable of reducing similar risks in future investigations. The Kaufman Inquiry generated hundreds of recommendations addressing investigative procedures, forensic science, disclosure obligations, prosecutorial conduct, and major case management. Many of those recommendations continue influencing Canadian policing today. For example, major investigations now place increased emphasis on documenting investigative reasoning. Rather than recording only final conclusions, investigators explain why particular decisions are made, what alternative explanations have been considered, and how evidence supports or contradicts competing theories. This documentation assists supervisors reviewing investigations while also benefiting future detectives who may revisit historical cases years later. The Jessup investigation demonstrates why such transparency matters. Had investigators in later decades lacked detailed records describing earlier investigative decisions, reassessing the case would have become substantially more difficult. Documentation preserved institutional memory across multiple generations of investigators. The case also strengthened appreciation for independent scientific review. Modern forensic laboratories employ extensive quality assurance measures including peer review, validation studies, accreditation requirements, and standardized reporting procedures. These safeguards seek to ensure that scientific conclusions remain objective regardless of investigative expectations. Science serves justice most effectively when it follows evidence rather than investigative assumptions. The experience of the Jessup investigation reinforced this principle. DNA did not simply support investigators' existing theory. It challenged that theory. Ultimately, it replaced it with one supported by objective biological evidence. For forensic scientists, this represents one of the discipline's greatest strengths. Reliable science is valuable precisely because it can correct mistaken assumptions rather than merely confirming existing beliefs. The investigation likewise illustrates how criminal justice systems balance certainty with uncertainty. Although DNA identified Calvin Hoover as the source of biological evidence recovered during the homicide investigation, investigators continued reviewing historical records carefully before making any public announcement. They examined Hoover's background, geographical connections, employment history, and opportunities to encounter Christine. This additional work reflected responsible investigative practice. Scientific evidence may answer one critical question